Three teenagers walked into the Nantahala backcountry on a Friday afternoon in late October. By Sunday morning, the only things left at their campsite were a tent folded inward like a closed fist, a cooler that had been opened without being torn, and a ring of footprints in the mud that measured 19 inches from heel to toe. I have patrolled these mountains for 31 years. I have carried out the lost, the injured, and the dead. But what we found on the 7th Ridge that week is the reason I no longer take the night shift, and it is the reason the oldest families in this county still refuse to say a certain name out loud after sundown. Before this story is over, you are going to understand why. If you want to hear what these mountains hide when the visitor centers close, make sure you are subscribed, because the stories I tell here do not appear anywhere else. The call came through dispatch at 6:40 in the morning. Kaylee Hart had worked the radio desk at our district station for almost 2 decades, and in all that time I had never once heard her voice shake. It shook that morning. She said a camp host named Brielle Fox was on the line from the Wolf Hollow site, reporting 3 miners missing from their permit location near the 7th Ridge. Trinity Knight, 15 years old, Marcus Dunn, 16, Brooke Hansen, 17. They had checked in Friday at 4 in the afternoon. Brielle had seen their fire Friday night from the host cabin, a small orange point far up the drainage. Saturday night there had been no fire. Sunday at dawn she hiked up to check on them because something about that missing fire had kept her awake, and what she found made her run the entire 2 miles back down without stopping once. She was 60 years old, and she ran it in under 40 minutes. I drove out with Trevor Grant, the other senior ranger in our district. Trevor was 59, a year older than Kaylee, and he had a habit of narrating everything he saw out loud, which usually annoyed me. That morning I was grateful for it, because it gave the silence something to push against. The campsite sat in a flat pocket of rhododendron just below the ridgeline, where the old growth begins. People do not realize how different old growth feels until they stand inside it. The trunks are wide as truck hoods. The canopy closes so completely overhead that even at noon the forest floor lives in a green gloom, and sound behaves strangely, arriving from directions it should not. The tent was the first wrong thing. It had not been cut. It had not been torn. It had been pressed flat from above. The poles snapped inward, the fabric folded down over the sleeping bags like a hand closing over 3 small birds. Everything the kids owned was still inside: phones, wallets, boots. All 3 pairs of boots lined up at the door of the tent, exactly where they had taken them off. Trevor stopped narrating when he saw the boots. Nobody walks into the Appalachian backcountry at night in October in their socks. Not one person, certainly not 3. The second wrong thing was the cooler. It was a heavy latching model, the kind that takes an adult 2 hands to open. It stood open, and the food inside had been gone through, but not the way a bear goes through food. A bear shreds. A bear leaves the site looking like a landfill. This food had been sorted. The fruit was gone. The jerky was gone. The candy bars had been unwrapped, the wrappers folded, and the chocolate left behind untouched, as if something had peeled them open out of pure curiosity and then decided it did not care for what it found. The third wrong thing was the prints. They came up out of the creek bed below the site, crossed the soft ground at the edge of the clearing, circled the tent 1 full time, and went back the way they had come. 19 inches long, almost 8 inches across at the ball of the foot. The stride between them was over 5 feet, longer than my entire leg, and at no point did the stride shorten or stumble. Whatever made them had walked on 2 feet, slowly, calmly, all the way around 3 sleeping children, and the depth of those prints in that mud told me it weighed more than Trevor and me put together. Trevor crouched over the clearest print for a long time. Then he said the thing I had been refusing to think. He said, "Paul, there is a toe push here. Flat fakes do not leave a toe push." This foot flexed. I told him to photograph everything and say nothing on the open channel. Then I stood up and looked at the wall of old growth rising toward the 7th Ridge. And for the first time in 31 years of doing this job, I had the very specific feeling that the forest was looking back. By noon we had a full search operation. Scott Riley came up from the county with his tracking dogs. Scott was 61 and had found more lost hikers in these mountains than any human being alive. His dogs had pulled scent off avalanche debris and out of flooded creek beds. They were not animals that frightened easily. Both dogs refused the trail. They took the scent from the kids' boots eagerly enough, pulled hard for the first 100 yards up the drainage, and then hit some invisible line below the ridge and simply stopped. The lead dog, a big shepherd named Otis, sat down, faced back the way we had come, and began to shake. Scott had worked that dog for 9 years. He told me he had never seen Otis sit on an active trail in his life. When he tried to walk him forward by the lead, Otis screamed. I do not mean barked, I mean a sound I did not know a dog could produce. We sent the dogs down and went up on foot. 16 searchers in a line, 50 feet apart, moving through timber so old that some of those trees were standing before this country had a name. That was when we started finding the structures. You hear about them online, and you laugh. Sticks lean together in the woods, people say. Branches fall. Weather does strange things. I am telling you what I measured with my own tape. Trees 4 and 5 inches thick, snapped at head height, the snap green and fresh, and then woven together into arches over the game trails. Not leaned, woven. One of them had a top beam that I could not lift with both arms, and it had been placed 9 feet off the ground, balanced into the forks of 2 living oaks. There was no machinery within 6 miles of that spot. There was no road. There was nothing up there but us, and the gloom under that canopy, and those arches standing over the trail like doorways, and every single one of them was oriented the same way, facing downhill, facing the campsite, facing us. Around 4 in the afternoon the knocking started, one single knock, far off to the north, like a baseball bat striking a trunk. 30 seconds later, an answer from the south, then west. We stood in our line in that timber and listened to something coordinate around us in a language of wood on wood. And I watched grown men who had done this work their whole lives go quiet in a way I had never seen. Paige Black found me at the staging area that evening. Paige was 62 and ran the general store at the bottom of the mountain, and her family had been in that hollow since before the park existed. She did not waste a word. She told me to go talk to Vincent Armstrong before I sent anyone else up that ridge in the dim hours. And when I asked why, she looked up at the mountain and said, because my grandmother called that ridge the porch of the hill people, and in 90 years nobody in my family has set one foot on it after sunset, and every one of us has died old. I want to stop right here, at the exact spot where I stood in that gravel lot deciding whether to listen to her. Because if you have made it this far into the woods with me, the numbers say you have probably not touched the like button or left a single word in the comments yet. Do it now, while the searchers are still safe at the staging area. Because once we go back up that ridge, I am going to need to know somebody is out there listening. Vincent Armstrong was 63, a heavy equipment operator most of his life, and a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. He met me on his porch that night with 2 cups of coffee already poured, as if he had been told I was coming, and maybe he had, because nothing moves in that hollow without Paige Black knowing about it. I told him everything: the flattened tent, the boots, the sorted food, the prints with the flexing toes, the arches, the knocking. Vincent listened with his eyes closed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me one question. He asked whether the prints had circled the tent and left, or circled the tent and stayed. I said they had left. He nodded slowly and said, then the children may still be alive, because it was not hunting, it was collecting. He told me his grandfather's people had stories about the tall ones of the high ridges going back further than anyone could count. Some of the old stories spoke of Sulkalu, the great lord of the game, the slant-eyed giant of the hunting grounds, who could read a man's thoughts and demanded respect from anyone who walked his slopes. Other stories, the quieter ones, the ones told only inside the house, spoke of the hairy people of the hills, the wild ones who lived in the laurel thickets where no trail goes. His grandfather had not treated these as fireside entertainment. His grandfather had treated them the way you treat a fact about the weather. You do not whistle on the high ridges at night. You do not take more game than you need. And if you find a place where the walking sticks are woven over the trail, you have found a property line, and you turn around, because the woven sticks are not a warning. They are a courtesy. They are the only courtesy you will get. I asked him what happens to people who cross the line. Vincent opened his eyes and looked at me, and he said, mostly nothing, Paul. Mostly they walk through and feel watched and come home and tell everyone the stories are nonsense. But every few generations, somebody crosses on the wrong night, in the wrong season, when the tall ones have a reason to be interested. And then the stories get a new chapter. I asked him what reason they could possibly have to be interested in 3 teenagers. He stood up, took my empty cup and said, that is the wrong question. The right question is what those 3 did on Friday night, before the fire went out. Then he told me he would come with us at first light, and that nobody, under any circumstances, was to go up before then. Somebody went up before then. Trevor Grant did not believe in courtesy lines. At 4 in the morning, he signed out a radio, left a note on the operations board that said checking the north drainage, and walked up the 7th Ridge alone with a headlamp and 30 years of confidence that the woods contained nothing he had not already met. His first radio call came at 5:17. His voice was level. He said he had found a shoe print, a human one, small, consistent with one of the kids, heading uphill at a run, and he was following it. His second call came at 5:41, and his voice was not level anymore. He said the print line had ended at the base of a rock face, just stopped, mid-stride, and that the brush around him had started moving against the wind. Then he said, and I am quoting the recording that still exists on our dispatch log, he said, "Kaylee, there is something standing in the laurel about 20 yards on my left. It has been standing there for 10 minutes. It is taller than the laurel." Kaylee told him to back out slowly the way he came. His third transmission was 30% breathing and 70% a sound in the background that I have listened to perhaps 200 times since, trying to convince myself it was an elk. It begins low, like a bull, and then it climbs. And where an elk bugle thins out into a whistle, this sound widens into something with a chest behind it the size of a furnace, and underneath the howl, clearly, unmistakably, there are syllables, rhythm, structure, like speech played at half speed through a chest that was never meant for it. Then Trevor's radio went to static and stayed there. We went up at first light, every searcher we had, with Vincent Armstrong walking point even though he had no badge and no official reason to be there, and not one person questioned it. At the courtesy line, where the dogs had quit, Vincent stopped us. He took a pouch of tobacco from his jacket, spoke quietly in Cherokee for almost a minute, and laid the tobacco on a flat stone beside the trail. Then he said, "Now we are guests. Walk like guests. Take nothing. Touch nothing. If you see one, lower your eyes and keep walking, because staring is a challenge, and you will lose the challenge." The forest above the line was the quietest place I have ever stood. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, just the creak of trunks and our own boots, and that endless green gloom pressing down through the canopy. We found Trevor at 8 in the morning, 2 full miles from his last radio position, sitting upright against the roots of a white oak, with his arms wrapped around his knees. He was alive. His headlamp, his pack, and his radio were stacked beside him in a neat pile, the way you would set out items for inspection. He had not stacked them. He could not have. His right ankle was broken so badly the boot pointed the wrong way, and the medic said afterward that with that injury he could not have walked 10 feet, let alone 2 miles of ridgeline. Something had carried him gently enough that there was not one scratch on him above the ankle, and set him down where we would find him, on the downhill side of the courtesy line, just barely on our side of it. Returned the way you return something that wandered into your yard. Trevor did not speak that day. Weeks later, the only thing he would say about the gap in his memory was this. He said it smelled like wet horse and turned earth, and the hand was patient. We found the children an hour after we found Trevor. They were inside one of the arches, all 3 of them, asleep in a pile like puppies, in their socks, filthy, dehydrated, scratched by laurel, and otherwise whole. Around them, arranged in a half circle on a bed of moss, were the apples from their cooler, untouched, and a pile of chestnuts that no human had gathered, because the nearest surviving chestnut trees were a ridge and a half away. Trinity Knight woke first. She looked at me with eyes that had aged 10 years in 3 nights, and the first thing she said was, "We did not mean to laugh at it." The story came out in pieces over the following days, from her, from Marcus Dunn, from Brooke Hansen, each of them separately, each version matching the others in every detail that mattered. On Friday night, around the fire, they had heard a knock far up the ridge. Marcus had thought it was another camper fooling around, so he picked up a piece of firewood and knocked back, and all 3 of them laughed and hooted and did exaggerated howls at the tree line, the way teenagers do, mocking the night to prove they were not afraid of it. The knocking had come closer. They thought it was funny right up until the moment the firelight reached the edge of the clearing and showed them the lower half of 2 legs standing at the tree line, legs covered in reddish hair, with knees at the height of Marcus's chest, and then the fire had gone out, not died down. Gone out, all at once, like a breath across a candle. They remembered running uphill in the dim, which is the wrong direction, the direction nobody chooses, unless something is hurting you. They remembered being lifted. Trinity said it was like being picked up by weather. They remembered being set down inside the arch, and they remembered, every night, the chestnuts appearing, and a shape the size of a standing bear but wrong in its proportions, sitting at the open side of the arch with its back to them. Guarding them, Brooke insisted. Guarding them from something further up the ridge that none of them ever saw, but that all three of them heard, once, on the second night. A reply howl from the high country, deeper than the first, and at the sound of it, their guard had stood to its full height, and Marcus, who is 6 feet tall, swears its head was level with a branch he could not have touched with a jumped reach. Vincent Armstrong listened to all of this without surprise. When the last interview was done, he told me the part one think about every single shift. He said, the young one that took them was correcting their manners, Paul. They mocked the ridge, so the ridge taught them. But it kept them safe while it did it, and it gave them back. That tells you it was raised right. What you should be losing sleep over is the second howl, because something raised it, and the something is still up there, and it is older, and it heard 3 human children laugh at its family. The official report says the children became disoriented and were found by searchers. The official report says Trevor Grant fell. The official report does not mention the arches, which I went back to photograph 2 weeks later and could not find, not one stick of them, as if the forest had taken down its decorations after the guests went home. There is one more detail, and I include it because Kaylee Hart made me promise I would never leave it out. 3 nights after we brought the children down, the station phone rang at 2 in the morning. Kaylee answered. The line was open, and on it she could hear wind, and trees, and far away, very faint, the sound of a creek. No voice. The call lasted 4 minutes, and the trace came back to the emergency call box at the Wolf Hollow trailhead, the one at the bottom of the 7th ridge. That call box has a steel door with a latch, and to place a call you must open the door, lift the receiver, and press a button the size of a coat hook. Brielle Fox checked the box at dawn. The door was closed, the receiver was on its hook, but pressed into the frost on the steel, clear as a signature, was the print of a hand. 5 fingers, a palm, a thumb, human in every proportion except one. It was 14 inches from wrist to fingertip. Kaylee keeps the photograph in her desk drawer, and she has never once shown it to anyone who laughed at this story. Only to the ones who went quiet. The 7th ridge is closed now. The closure order cites unstable terrain. I wrote that order myself, and I signed it knowing it was a lie of kindness, the same kind the old families have been telling for 200 years. Last month, on a clear, cold evening, I stood at the trailhead at sunset doing my final sweep, and from far up in the old growth, one single knock rolled down the mountain. Polite, unhurried, the sound of something marking the line for the night. I did not knock back, I never will. And if you ever camp in the high country of the Appalachians, and the woods go quiet, and a knock comes down the ridge to find you, remember the only rule that matters up there. You are not the owner. You are not even the renter. You are a guest on the porch of the hill people, and a guest does not mock the house. Some places were never lost, you see. They were kept. Good night, and stay off the 7th ridge. 3 knocks. Always 3. Wood striking wood, somewhere out in the lightless timber, 4 miles from the nearest road, at an hour when nothing human should be awake on that mountain. I have heard those knocks 11 times in my career. 10 of those times, somebody went missing within 48 hours. This is the story of the 11th time, the autumn when 3 teenagers walked into the Nantahala backcountry, and only one of them walked out able to speak. And what she said to me in that hospital room is the reason I will never again set foot past the boundary cairns after sundown. The Cherokee elders who lived in these mountains long before any of us had a name for what walks up there. They called him the master of the game. We call him something else, and he knows my face now. People imagine that a ranger in the southern Appalachians spends his days rescuing lost tourists and writing citations for unattended campfires. And for most of my 22 years in this district, that was true. The Nantahala National Forest covers more than 500,000 acres of western North Carolina, a green ocean of ridgelines and laurel hells and coves so steep and tangled that there are hollows in this forest no boot has touched in a century. I patrol a district on the eastern edge of it, a place the old maps call Shadow Ridge, though the official signage uses a friendlier name now. The locals never adopted the friendly name. Locals have long memories. It started on the 2nd of October, a Thursday, a little after 1 in the morning. I was at the Wolf Branch Fire Tower finishing the last overnight shift of the season, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, when the first knock rolled up out of the valley. A single, heavy, percussive crack, like a baseball bat, swung full force against the trunk of an oak. I set the coffee down, 10 seconds of silence, then a second knock, closer. Then a third, closer still, and this one had weight behind it, a force that I felt in the floorboards of the tower 60 feet above the ground. I want to be precise about something because precision matters in a story like this. I am not a man who frightens easily. I have pulled drowned swimmers out of the Nantahala River. I have walked up on poachers holding rifles. I have been treed by a sow bear with cubs. Fear and I are old co-workers, and we are polite to each other. But those 3 knocks put something into my chest that I had not felt since I was a small boy listening to my grandfather talk about the things his own grandfather refused to discuss in the Cherokee language after sundown. It was not fear of injury. It was the older feeling, the one underneath, the feeling of being noticed. I logged the sounds in the station book the next morning. Possible tree fall, I wrote, because that is what you write. My supervisor at the time, a practical woman from Ohio, read the entry and said nothing. But Hollis, the retired ranger who still came around the station to drink our coffee and correct our map reading, looked at that entry for a long time. Hollis grew up in Snowbird, in the Cherokee community there, and his grandmother had been a fluent speaker, a keeper of the old stories. He asked me one question. He asked if the knocks had come up the valley or down it. Up, I told him, from the river toward the ridge. Hollis nodded the way a man nods when you confirm bad news he already suspected. He told me that his grandmother would have said the mountain was being closed, that something was walking the boundaries of its hunting ground, the way a farmer walks a fence line, and that the knocking was not a message for us. It was a message for everything else that lived up there. A warning to get out of the way. I asked him, half joking, who exactly was supposed to be doing this walking. Hollis did not smile. He said the old people called him Sulkalu, the slant-eyed giant, the lord of all the game animals, who lived inside the high balds and judged the conduct of hunters. He said the white settlers who came later met something in these same mountains, something huge and upright and covered in hair, and they did not know the old name for it, so they made up their own names. Wood Booger, the Boojum, and much later, when the cameras and the television shows came, Bigfoot. Hollis said the names changed every 100 years. The knocks never did. I would like to tell you that I took him seriously. I did not. I filed it with the rattlesnake superstitions and the planting by moon signs, the charming folklore of old mountain men. That was a failure of imagination on my part, and 3 children nearly paid for it. Before I take you up that mountain with me, I will say this one time and not again. If accounts like this one are the reason you lie awake listening to the sounds outside your own walls, subscribe to this channel because there are more files in my cabinet and I am finally ready to open them. The week after the knocks, the trail cameras started disappearing. We maintain a network of wildlife cameras throughout the district, sturdy units in steel security boxes, bolted and padlocked to tree trunks at chest height. On October 9th, I hiked in to swap the memory cards on the 4 cameras along Defeat Branch and found exactly none of them. Not stolen, you understand. Stolen cameras leave cut locks and pry marks. These boxes were gone entirely, and so was a portion of each tree. Something had gripped the steel housing and ripped it free, taking a slab of living oak the size of a dinner plate along with it, bolts and all. I found one of the boxes about 40 feet away, crushed nearly flat, folded along the middle the way a man folds a wallet. The padlock was still locked. I stood in that quiet cove holding 12 pounds of folded steel, and I became aware, in the way you become aware of rain beginning, that the forest around me had gone completely silent. No squirrels cutting in the hickories, no jays, not one bird. The only sound was Defeat Branch running over its stones, and underneath that, just once, far up the slope in the rhododendron where no trail goes, the soft, deliberate crack of a single breaking stick. I did not investigate. I am not ashamed to say it. 22 years of instinct stood up inside me all at once and said leave, and I left, and I felt eyes on the back of my neck for the entire 4 miles down, the pressure of attention as real as a hand between my shoulder blades. That was Thursday, October 9th. On Friday, October 10th, 3 students from Silva drove a borrowed pickup to the Shadow Ridge trailhead for a weekend of camping. Trinity Knight was 15, Marcus Dunn was 16. Brooke Hansen was 17. By Sunday night, their parents were calling my station, and the 11th time was underway. The call came in at 9:40 on Sunday evening. Brooke Hanson had texted her mother at noon on Saturday from the one spot on the ridge with cell coverage, a photo of the three of them grinning in front of their orange tent, the high balds rolling away behind them in the October sun. The plan was to hike out Sunday afternoon and be home for dinner. Dinner came and went. The borrowed pickup was still sitting at the trailhead when a deputy checked at 8. We launched the search at first light on Monday, October 13th. I want you to understand what a search in that country actually means, because the television gives people the wrong idea. The Shadow Ridge backcountry is not a park with lawns. It is vertical ground, slopes of 45 degrees and worse, choked with rhododendron and dog hobble so dense that a search line moves at a quarter-mile an hour, and a person lying unconscious 10 feet away can be invisible. We had 40 volunteers, 2 dog teams, and a helicopter on loan from the Forest Service, and against that country, it was nothing. I led the team that took the main ridge trail toward the campsite in the photo. We found the orange tent at 11 in the morning, pitched neat and tight in a grassy gap just below the second bald, exactly where experienced kids would pitch it. And everything about that campsite was wrong. The tent was zipped shut from the outside. Inside were 3 sleeping bags, 3 packed backpacks, 3 phones, and 3 pairs of boots. Whatever happened to those kids, it happened at night, and it took them out of that tent in their socks. 20 yards downhill, the food bag was still hanging from a bare line, untouched. No animal in these mountains leaves a hanging food bag alone for 2 nights. Below the tent, in the soft ground beside a seep spring, my second searcher, a quiet man who had hunted this district his whole life, crouched over something for a long time without speaking. I came and crouched beside him. It was a footprint. I am looking at the photograph of it right now as I record this, and my mouth still goes dry. 19.5 inches from heel to toe, 8 inches across the ball of the foot. 5 toes, no claw marks, the great toe aligned forward like a man and not opposed like a bear. The print was pressed almost 2 inches into ground that my own boot, with me weighing 210 pounds with my pack, dented less than half an inch. Whatever stood in that spot beside those sleeping children weighed more than half a ton, and it stood there on 2 legs. My searcher looked at me, and neither of us said the word out loud, because there are words you do not say on an official search with a radio on your chest. He covered the print with a sheet of bark, and we marked the location, and we kept that detail off the general channel. I told myself we did it to keep the volunteers focused. The truth is we did it because saying it would have made it real. The dogs would not work the scent trail. I have watched search dogs my whole career, and I have never seen anything like what those 2 hounds did on Shadow Ridge. They took the scent from the sleeping bags eagerly, followed it 30 yards up the slope toward the laurel, and then both dogs, 2 experienced animals from 2 different teams, sat down. They sat down, faced back downhill, and refused. One of them was trembling so hard her handler had to carry her off the mountain. Her handler told me, in 14 years, that dog had tracked through floods, gunfire, and a wildfire perimeter, and she had never once refused ground. That night, back at the command post at the trailhead, the parents stood at the tape line with their faces hollowed out by porch light, and I gave them the words we are trained to give. Kids shelter in place, kids follow water downhill, we find them. And while I was saying it, from far up the black wall of the mountain above us, clear enough that every person in that parking lot froze, came 3 knocks, wood on wood, evenly spaced, unhurried. 40 people heard it. The official explanation logged the next morning was a dead snag shifting in the wind. There was no wind that night. The flags on the command tent hung straight down like wet rags, and every man and woman in that lot stood staring up at the ridgeline until the silence got too heavy, and nobody said the word that time either. On Tuesday, the second day, we found the stick structures. 4 of them, spaced along the contour of the slope above the campsite, each one built the same way. Saplings, some of them thicker than my forearm, snapped off at a height of about 9 feet, brought together from different parts of the slope and woven into rough arches, almost like door frames, all 4 of them oriented so that the opening faced the children's tent below. Green wood, freshly broken, sap still bleeding. A botanist from the university later examined the breaks and wrote, in a report that went into a drawer and never came out, that the torsional force required to twist off a green hardwood sapling of that diameter exceeded anything a human being could produce by hand, with or without tools. I stood inside one of those arches, and I am 6 feet 2, and the top of it cleared my head by almost 3 feet. And I understood that I was standing in something that had been built. Not grown, not fallen, built, by hands, in the night, in silence, 100 yards from where 40 of us were sleeping in shifts. Hollis drove up to the command post that evening. He did not get out of his truck. He rolled down the window and looked at me for a moment and asked if we had found bent trees. I said yes. He asked which way the openings faced. I told him. Hollis closed his eyes, and this 76-year-old man who had survived 2 wars and 40 years of this wilderness gripped his steering wheel like a life ring, and he said the structures were not threats, they were markers. His grandmother had a word for them that he could not fully translate, but the closest English, he said, was claim. The children, Hollis told me, were inside the claim now, and if I wanted them back, the search line and the helicopter and the dogs were useless because the old one was not hiding them from us. He was keeping them. There was a difference, and the difference was the only hope we had. I asked Hollis what could possibly make it give them back. He said the old people knew. He said it took respect. And then he told me a story that his grandmother had made him swear never to repeat carelessly, and I am going to repeat it for you now, because you have come this far up the mountain with me, and you deserve to know what I knew, going into the worst night of my life. Sitting in his truck with the heater running, Hollis told me about Sulkaloo. In the old Cherokee accounts, he said, Sulkaloo was the master of all the game in the mountains, a giant who lived inside the high peaks, in a townhouse under the rock, and every deer and bear and turkey in these forests belonged to him the way cattle belong to a farmer. He was not a monster in the stories. He was an owner, a landlord of the wild places. Hunters who showed respect, who asked before they took, who wasted nothing, were permitted to hunt his herds and walk his ground. Hunters who took too much, who killed for vanity, who treated the high coves as if they belonged to men, found their rifles misfiring and their trails turning back on themselves, and sometimes those hunters did not come home at all, and the old people did not call it a tragedy. They called it a fine being collected. There was a carved boulder, Hollis said, over in the next county, that the old people said the giant had marked himself, scratching the boundary of his hunting ground into stone so that no one could claim ignorance. The boundary did not move when the government drew its own maps. The giant did not recognize our maps. The high country above the third fork of the creek, all of Shadow Ridge from the Seep Springs upward, that was inside his line, and it had always been inside his line, and the friendly new name on our signage meant exactly nothing. I asked Hollis why it would take children. Children take nothing. Children waste nothing. Hollis was quiet for a while. Then he said that in his grandmother's telling, Sulkaloo had once wanted a human wife and had courted her properly, by the old laws, sitting outside her home in the night, and the bargain had failed because the girl's family broke their word. The giant did not forget it. He was owed something by people, his grandmother said, owed it for 300 years, and every so often, when people on his ground grew careless and arrogant, he collected interest. He did not always keep what he took. Sometimes, she said, he only held it long enough for somebody to come up the mountain and acknowledge the debt. Acknowledge it how? I asked. Hollis looked at me, and his eyes in the dashboard light were the eyes of a man handing over something heavy. Somebody has to go up alone, he said, at night, unarmed, onto the claimed ground, past the markers, and ask. Not demand, ask. And whatever shows itself, whatever happens, you do not run, because everything in his herds runs, and if you run, you are telling him exactly what you are. I want to pause here, because the next part of this story does not come from me. It comes from 7 witnesses, and what they saw on the far side of the ridge that same Tuesday afternoon is the reason I finally believed every word the old man said. There is a hiking club out of Asheville that calls itself the Gray Blazers, retired folks, most of them past 55, who have walked every trail in 3 states. 7 of them were doing a loop on the north side of Shadow Ridge that week, completely unaware of the search on the south side. Paul Andrews, 57, a retired line foreman, was leading. With him were Kaylee Hart, 58, Trevor Grant, 59, Brielle Fox, 60, Scott Riley, 61, Paige Black, 62, and Vincent Armstrong, 63. 7 steady, unexcitable, experienced people. I have interviewed every one of them, some of them twice, and their accounts agree in every detail that matters. At about 4 in the afternoon, descending through open hardwoods toward Bearpen Gap, Paige Black stopped the line and pointed across the drainage. On the opposite slope, perhaps 200 yards away, something was moving through the trees. Paul Andrews told me his first thought was a black bear, and his second thought, in the same instant, was that he was looking at a bear walking on its hind legs uphill through deadfall without breaking stride. and that no bear on this earth has ever done that. It was upright. All 7 of them agree on that. It was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, and it was crossing 45-degree ground littered with fallen timber, the way you or I cross a parking lot, stepping over chest-high logs without a pause, without a stumble, arms swinging in long hanging arcs. Trevor Grant, who spent 30 years estimating freight, watched it pass directly beside a standing dead hemlock that we later measured at 11 feet to the first limb, and he says, flatly, every time, in the same words, that its shoulder was even with that limb. Kaylee Hart had her phone out and shaking. She captured 9 seconds of video. You can find worse footage on television every week. In her 9 seconds, you can see a tall, upright shape pass behind 2 trees and emerge on the far side of both. And you can see, in the last second, the shape stop and turn and look directly across the drainage at the camera. That is when they heard it, not a roar. All 7 of them, independently, refused the word roar. Vincent Armstrong, the oldest of them, a man who put in 30 years as a millwright around heavy machinery, described it best. He said it started below hearing, a pressure in the chest, like standing too close to a blast furnace, and then it rose into a sound that was almost a voice, almost words, a long, wavering, deafening call that slammed back and forth between the ridges until it seemed to come from everywhere, and the whole forest floor of birds went up at once like a lifted blanket. Brielle Fox dropped to her knees and could not explain why. Scott Riley, a deacon of his church, stood there with tears running into his collar, and then it was simply gone. 7 pairs of experienced eyes on one slope, and between one breath and the next, nothing. No crashing retreat, no movement in the brush. Gone the way a fish is gone when it stops mattering to the fish that you can see it. The gray blazers came off that mountain in the gloom with their headlamps shaking, and they walked into our command post on the south side by accident, looking for a phone. And that is how, on Tuesday night, the 11th night of knocking in my career, I came to be standing in a parking lot watching 9 seconds of video over and over while 2 desperate families watched my face. And I made the only decision left to make. I told my supervisor I was going to check the upper springs alone at first light. That part was a lie. I had no intention of waiting for light. I left the command post at 2 in the morning on Wednesday, October 15th, while the overnight shift dozed in their trucks. I left my sidearm locked in my vehicle, which violated policy and every instinct I owned. I carried a headlamp I did not intend to use, a thermos, my radio with the volume off, and, on Hollis's instruction, a pouch of loose tobacco and a side of bacon from the supply tent. Because the old story said you do not walk onto another man's land to ask a favor with empty hands. A moonless mountain at night is not merely unlit, it is a place that has been turned off. Under the closed canopy, the blackness is total, a pressure against the open eye, and you navigate by the feel of the trail under your boots and the small change in the air when the trees open out. I climbed by feel for 2 hours, past the campsite, past the seep spring where the print was, and when my outstretched hand touched the smooth, twisted wood of the first marker arch, my heart was hitting so hard I could hear it in my back teeth. I stopped at the arch and I spoke out loud. I feel foolish even now, telling you this, a grown man alone on a mountain in the small hours, announcing himself to the trees. I said my name. I said I worked this forest, but I did not own it, and had never owned it. I said 3 children had been taken from inside the line, and that they were not hunters, and had taken nothing, and that I had come up alone and unarmed to ask for them back. And then I stepped through the arch, onto the claimed ground, and the temperature dropped the way it drops when you walk into a meat locker. And every cricket and katydid on that mountainside stopped at once, as if a switch had been thrown. Listen, before I tell you what was waiting for me up there, I need 30 seconds of your time. You have been with me on this mountain for half an hour, and the numbers tell me most of you have not yet touched the like button or dropped a single word in the comments. Do it now, while I catch my breath, because the next part is the part 1 have never told anyone. And I want to know afterward whether you would have kept climbing. The first thing I noticed past the markers was the smell. Everyone who has been close describes the same smell, and no one describes it well. The nearest I can come is a wet dog rolled in carrion and crushed skunk cabbage, but underneath it there was something older, like the inside of a cave, like turned earth, like time. It came in waves on the still air, which means it was moving, and it was circling me, and I never heard one footfall. Half a ton on 2 legs, on a slope of dry October leaves, in absolute silence. That silence was the most frightening thing on that mountain. Worse than the knocks. The knocks, at least, were honest. I kept climbing. The trail bent around an outcrop the maps call the chimney, and as I came around it I saw, far up through the trees, a light. Not a flashlight. A low, dim, reddish glow at ground level, the color of the last coal in a dying fire. And it was coming from the mouth of the rock overhang below the summit bald, a shelter cave the old people used for 1,000 years and we now keep gated to protect the artifacts inside. The steel gate was peeled open like the lid of a can, and in the faint red glow at the mouth of that overhang, sitting upright with her arms wrapped around her knees, in her socks, alive, was Brooke Hanson. I have replayed the next 60 seconds every night for 2 years. I moved toward her, slow and low, whispering her name. Her head turned to me, and her eyes were open, and they were wrong. Not injured. Wrong. They were the eyes of someone watching a film the rest of us could not see. She looked straight at me, a uniformed ranger materializing out of the night 60 hours into her disappearance, and her face did not change at all. She lifted one hand, very slowly, and put one finger to her lips, and then she pointed at the wall of rhododendron to my left, 10 feet from me. And from inside it, something exhaled. I heard the breath. I felt the breath. It moved the hair on my forearms, a slow, hot, enormous bellows of air. The exhale of a chest with the capacity of an oil drum, and with it came that smell, close and thick, and my body did what the dogs did. Every cell I owned sat down and faced downhill. There is a fear below thinking, a basement under the mind, and I went down into it standing perfectly still with a pouch of tobacco in my fist. It rose up out of the laurel. I will describe it once, plainly, and you can do with my description whatever you need to do to sleep tonight. It stood up out of brush that was shoulder high on me, and it kept going up, and the dim red light from the cave mouth reached just far enough to sketch the edges of it. 9 feet would be a conservative number. The shoulders were wider than my dining table. The arms hung past where knees should be. It was covered in hair that ate the light, except across the face, where leathery gray-black skin caught a faint shine, and the face is the part one cannot retire. It was not the face of an ape. It was a face with a heavy brow and a wide flat nose and a jaw like a bridge footing, and set deep under that brow were 2 eyes with a dull amber shine, set at a slight, distinct slant. Exactly as the oldest stories in these mountains have insisted for longer than this country has existed. The slant-eyed giant. The people who named him were not guessing, they were describing. It looked down at me, and I want to find language for what was in that look, and I keep failing, so I will tell you what was not in it. There was no hunger in it, there was no rage. What was in that look was assessment. The way you look at a delivery driver standing on your porch. It knew what I was, it knew why I had come. And it was deciding, with all the time in the world, whether I had done this correctly. I did not run. I want some credit for that, because everything in me was screaming. I held out the tobacco pouch and the bacon in both hands, arms shaking so badly the paper rustled, and I said, in a voice I did not recognize, the words Hollis had given me. I said I had come to ask, only to ask. The giant looked at my offering for a long moment. Then it turned its head, slow as a turning planet, and looked up the slope toward the summit bald, and from up there in the blackness, clear and close and impossible, came a sound I knew. A sound that had no business on that mountain. It was Marcus Dunn's voice, and it was laughing. I need you to sit with that sound the way I had to sit with it. A 16-year-old boy, missing for 3 nights in freezing temperatures with no boots and no coat, laughing on a bald summit at 4 in the morning. Not screaming, not crying for help. Laughing, easy and unbothered, the way a kid laughs at a kitchen table. And the giant had turned to look toward that laughter the way a father glances toward a back room where the children are playing. That is when the worst idea I have ever had arrived in my head, fully formed, and I could not make it leave. The old stories say Tsul Kalu lives in a townhouse under the rock, with fires and provisions and room for guests, and that mortals who visit it lose their hold on time, and come out of the mountain believing a single night has passed, when the world outside has spent 7 years grieving them. I stood at the gate of that story, the peeled steel, the coal-red glow from inside the overhang, the laughter from above, the girl at the threshold with her finger to her lips. I was not standing at a crime scene. I was standing at a doorstep, and the children were inside the house, and the owner of the house was deciding whether to answer my knock. The giant turned back to me. It took 1 step, and the ground carried the step into my boots, and it bent down toward me. down and down, folding that enormous frame until the great gray-black face hung level with mine, close enough that the heat radiating off it touched my skin like an open stove. The amber eyes moved across my face. I could see the brow furrow. I want everyone listening to understand what I am saying. It had expressions. It was thinking, visibly, behind its eyes, and whatever was performing that thinking was not simpler than me. It reached out and took the offering. The hand that closed over my two hands was big enough that the tobacco pouch and the bacon and both of my fists fit inside it the way an egg fits in a man's palm, and the palm was leather and warm, and it took the gift with a care, an actual precise gentleness, that broke something loose in my chest, because gentleness from a thing of that size is more terrifying than fury. Fury you can map. Gentleness means a mind. Then it straightened up to its full height, put its head back, and spoke. I am calling it speech because I have no honest alternative. It was not the blast furnace call the gray blazers heard. It was low, rhythmic, structured, a string of deep sounds with stresses and pauses, rising at the end the way a question rises, and it was not addressed to me. It was addressed to the mountain, and the mountain answered. From the summit bawled one knock, from the drainage far below, where I had climbed, a second. From the ridge across the valley, miles off, faint as a heartbeat, a third. Brooke Hanson stood up at the cave mouth. She walked to me, in her socks, steady as a sleepwalker, and took my hand, and her hand was warm. 60 hours of October nights, and her hand was warm as toast. She looked up at the giant, and the giant looked down at her, and I watched, holding my breath, as the great head inclined toward her, once, slowly. A nod. Whatever had passed between that child and that ancient landlord in the house under the rock, it ended in courtesy. It pointed downhill with 1 yard long arm. The instruction did not require translation. We went. I do not remember most of the descent. I remember Brooke's hand in mine, and her silence, and her steadiness on ground where I stumbled. I remember reaching the marker arch in the first gray dilution of dawn, and stepping through it, and feeling the air change back, the cold becoming merely cold, the quiet becoming merely quiet. And I remember the radio on my chest, dead static all night, suddenly crackling alive with my supervisor's voice, half frantic, saying the words that took my legs out from under me. So that I sat straight down on the trail with a teenage girl patting my shoulder. Both boys had just walked into the command post under their own power. Trinity Knight and Marcus Dunn had come out of the Laurel at the trailhead, 4 miles from where I stood, in their socks, warm, calm, uninjured, asking if breakfast was ready, while the entire camp stood around them in stunned silence. They believed it was Saturday morning. They believed they had been gone one night. It was Wednesday. It was the morning of the 6th day since they had zipped that tent. Hold that arithmetic in your head. We lose the count somewhere, the boys and the searchers and the calendars disagreeing with each other, and every version of the count was wrong by a margin that no one has ever been able to make add up, and the official file simply omits the question. The mountain did something to those days. The old stories warned about exactly this, and the old stories, I am telling you, do not exaggerate. If anything, the old stories are polite. The hospital in Silva kept all 3 of them for 2 days of observation. The medical staff found nothing, no frostbite, no dehydration, no injuries, no exposure damage of any kind, on 3 children who had supposedly spent 5 October nights above 4,000 feet in their socks. One of the attending staff pulled me aside in the corridor and asked me, quietly, off any record, where those kids had actually been, because their condition was not consistent with any version of the official story. And I looked at that good, rational, exhausted professional, and I said I did not know. And that was the first time in my career I lied to protect the truth. Trinity and Marcus remembered almost nothing, and what they remembered like a dream remembered at noon. Warmth, a red glow, a feeling, Marcus said, of being looked after. He used those words, looked after, and then he frowned, like the words had arrived in his mouth from somewhere else, and he never elaborated. And within a month both boys had politely stopped answering questions, and I think that was a mercy, and I did not push. Brooke was different. Brooke remembered. She asked for me on the 2nd evening. Her parents stepped out, and I sat down by the bed, and this 17-year-old girl looked at me with those eyes that were still watching the other film, and she spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, in a voice as flat and careful as a deposition, and I am going to give you the substance of it, because I promised her I would. Someday, when she was far enough away from these mountains. She is far away now. she made me wait until she was. She said it took them on the first night, and there was no violence in it. None, and that was the horror of it. She woke because the tent was open and the cold was coming in, and Trinity and Marcus were already walking away up the slope in single file in the moonless black, calm as commuters, and she got up and followed them because her legs were doing it, and her fear was present but far away, behind glass, like a fire alarm ringing in another building. Something enormous walked beside them the whole way up, just at the edge of vision, and she said the strangest part was the courtesy of it, the way it kept pace, the way it lifted Marcus over the deadfalls with one hand under his arm, the way you would help a small child over a curb. She said the inside of the overhang was bigger than the outside. I asked her to repeat that, and she did, in the same flat voice with her eyes on me, daring me to write it down. Bigger inside than outside. Warm, a red fire with no smoke. And it was not empty. And here her voice dropped to almost nothing, and the hair on my arms has never fully settled since. She said the old one was not alone in the mountain. She heard others, further back where the red light gave out, big ones and smaller ones, and once, from deep in the rock, a sound she knew immediately and absolutely, because she has 3 younger siblings. Somewhere under Shadow Ridge, in the lightless warm interior of that mountain, something very young was fussing, and something very large was soothing it, in low rhythmic tones, in something old and patient that was almost a lullaby. It is not one creature, whatever the television wants. It is a household. It has been a household since before the first English word was ever spoken against those slopes, and the old people of these mountains knew it so well they recorded its address, and we paved our roads and printed our friendly trail names right up to the property line of something that has never once recognized our deed. She said the days in there felt like one long evening, and she said the reason the old one came out to the cave mouth on the last night, the reason it stood up out of the laurel to look at me, was that it heard me say the words at the marker arch. She knew this, she said, because when I spoke down there at the boundary, a quarter-mile of mountainside away, far beyond any human earshot, the giant lifted its head by the fire and turned toward my voice, and it made a sound to the others, and the sound, Brooke swears to this, the sound had satisfaction in it. It had been waiting 4 nights for one of us to remember our manners. And then she told me the last thing, the thing I asked her never to tell her parents, and she has kept that bargain, and tonight I am breaking mine, because I am getting old and the file cabinet is heavy. She said that before it sent her out to the cave mouth to wait for me, the old one bent down to her, the way it would later bend down to me, and it looked at her for a long time, and then it touched her, once, on the breastbone, with one finger, with that same impossible gentleness. And she said she understood the touch. Not heard, not imagined. Understood, the way you understand a period at the end of a sentence. It meant remembered. Not you are remembered, just remembered. A receipt, a dead entry in a ledger 300 years old, marked partially paid, and the account left open. The Gray Blazers never published the video. They voted on it. 7 gray heads in a living room in Asheville, and Kaylee Hart deleted it in front of the others, and Paul Andrews told me why in one sentence. He said some things lose their truth when you hand them to strangers. They still hike. They do not hike Shadow Ridge. Vincent Armstrong, the millwright, calls me every October 2nd, and we do not talk about much, and the call is not really about talking. Hollis passed 2 winters ago, in his sleep, in his own bed in Snowbird, in his 91st year if you believed his license, and somewhat later than that if you believed him. The morning of his funeral, the men digging at the cemetery up the cove stopped work, because from the ridge above the graveyard, in broad daylight, witnessed by 4 members of the burial party, there came 3 knocks, evenly spaced, unhurried, wood against wood. They were not afraid, the diggers said afterward. It did not feel like a threat. It felt like an old neighbor at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, paying respects. I still wear the uniform. I still work the district. But I have walked my last step past the Seep Springs, and when the young rangers transfer in, full of fitness and satellites and certainty, I take each one up the main trail exactly as far as the first marker arch, which still stands, green wood that has never rotted in all these years, and I tell them whatever lie the weather suggests, washouts, bear activity, unstable snags, anything that keeps them below the line after sundown. They believe me because of my years. The years are not why they should believe me, because here is how I will leave you tonight. 11 days ago, on the 2nd of October, almost 2 years to the hour since this story began, my phone rang at 1 in the morning. It was the young ranger on the overnight at Wolf Branch Tower, and her voice was steady the way a voice is steady when it is working very hard. and she said she was probably losing her mind. But she had just heard 3 knocks come up the valley. And then, she said, and here the steadiness failed her, then something out there in the black had knocked a 4th time. 4 knocks. In 30 years of records and 2 centuries of stories, the count has never changed. And all I can think, lying awake in these long nights since, is that a 4th knock is not a warning, and it is not a boundary being walked. A 4th knock is something new being said. And somewhere on Shadow Ridge, on ground that was never ours, the owner of these mountains has opened the ledger again. 17 trail cameras watched the ridgeline above Hollow Creek. On the morning of October 9th, every single one of them was pointed at the sky, not knocked over, not broken, turned. Each camera had been lifted off its mounting strap, rotated upward with a precision that no bear and no storm could ever manage, and set back in place so that all 17 lenses stared straight up into the gray Appalachian sky. Whatever did it had walked a 9-mile line through some of the steepest country in the eastern mountains in a single night, and it had wanted us blind. I have been a ranger in the Black Fern District for 11 years. My name does not matter yet. What matters is that 2 hikers were already missing when those cameras turned, and by the time we understood what the cameras meant, the woods had taken 3 more people. This is the report I was never allowed to file. The call came through dispatch at 6:40 in the evening, October 7th. Ariana Larson, 44 years old, 16 years on the radio. A woman who had talked lost children out of ravines and heart attack victims through their worst hours without her voice ever cracking. She did not crack that evening either, but I heard something underneath her words, something careful, like a person stepping around broken glass. Patrick, she said, I have a vehicle at the Hollow Creek trailhead that has been sitting for 3 days. Registration comes back to a Tyler Berry, 39, out of Roanoke. His permit says 2 people, him and a Bella Matthews, 40. Out and back on the Skyline Bench Trail. They were due down Sunday afternoon. It was Wednesday. I want to tell you that I felt nothing unusual, that it was just another overdue party, the kind we resolve 4 or 5 times a season with a sprained ankle and an embarrassed apology. But that would be a lie, and I promised myself this account would contain no lies. The truth is that the woods had felt wrong for almost a month. Small things. Squirrels gone quiet on the eastern benches, deer moving in the middle of the day, fast, heads low, like animals that had stopped caring about hunters because they were worried about something worse. A smell on certain switchbacks, thick and sour, like wet dog rolled in spoiled meat, there and then gone with the wind, and the knocks. I had heard them twice while closing out the high campsites. A single sharp crack of wood against wood, far off, deliberate, answered 10 seconds later by another from a different ridge. Old-timers around here call it timber talk, and they say it with a smile that never reaches their eyes. I drove to the trailhead that night with my partner, Gabriella Pierce, 38 years old, former smoke jumper, the calmest human being I have ever shared a truck with. She read the permit copy by flashlight while gravel popped under our tires. Experienced pair, she said. He has done the Benton Mackay and most of the AT. She runs ultras. These are not people who get lost on a marked bench trail. The parking area sat empty, except for Tyler Berry's gray pickup. Frost had built on the windshield in 3-day layers. Gabriella walked the perimeter with her light while I checked the truck. Doors locked, 2 coffee cups in the holder, mold already growing a pale skin across the surface of one. Then Gabriella called my name from the tree line, and her voice had a flatness to it that made my stomach drop before I even turned around. She was standing at the trail register box. The box is steel, bolted to a locust post sunk in concrete. The post was snapped off at knee height, sheared like a pencil, and the steel box itself had been thrown, not dropped, thrown, into the brush almost 40 feet up the slope. We found the register book later, pages scattered across the laurel. The last entry was Tyler Berry's, dated 4 days earlier. Under the column marked notes, in handwriting that started neat and ended ragged, he had written one line, something paced us on the bench all afternoon. Big, bipedal, not a bear, camping early, fire all night. If you are listening to this story right now, do me one favor before we go any further. Press that subscribe button. I am going to be telling more of what happened in these mountains, the parts that never reached any newspaper, and I need people to hear it. That button costs you nothing. What is coming in this story cost 5 people everything. By first light on October 8th, we had a hasty search team assembled at the trailhead. Deputy Jason Arnold from the county, 41 years old, built like a fire plug and twice as hard to move. Madeline Dean, 42, our best canine handler, with her shepherd Ridge, a dog that had found 19 living people and 11 who were not. 2 volunteers from the local search and rescue chapter, Adam Wheeler, 45, a retired lineman who knew these hollows better than the maps did, and Serenity Burke, 46, a quiet woman who taught wilderness first aid and could carry a 60-pound pack up a grade that would fold most 20-year-olds. 6 of us, plus the dog, walking up the Skyline bench trail under a low ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the ridges like a hand. Ridge struck a scent within the first mile and pulled hard. Madeline read his body the whole way, and around mile 3 she said something I have thought about every day since. He is on them, she said, but he keeps checking behind us. 19 finds, and I have never once seen this dog check behind us on a hot trail. We reached the designated backcountry site, Camp 4, at 11 in the morning. I have processed bear strikes on campsites. I have seen what a 500-pound boar black bear does to a tent when there is food inside. I am telling you, with 11 years of experience behind the words, that no bear did what we walked into. The tent was not torn. It was flattened, driven into the ground. The aluminum poles not snapped but folded, pressed down as if something of enormous weight had simply stepped on the entire structure and held it there. Tyler Berry's bear canister, a $100 hard-sided cylinder that black bears in the Adirondacks have famously failed to open for decades, was 30 feet away. It had been peeled, not chewed, peeled, the lid sheared off along the threads, the way a man opens an orange, and the food was untouched. Every freeze-dried packet, every protein bar, scattered in the leaves, uneaten. Whatever opened that canister had not been hungry, it had been curious, or it had been making a point. Jason Arnold crouched at the edge of the site where a seep kept the ground soft, and he went very still, and then he said, in a voice I had never heard from him, "Patrick, you need to look at this, and you need to tell me I am wrong about what I am looking at." The print was 19 inches long. I laid my boot inside it, a size 12, and there was room left over at the heel and the toes both. 5 toes, no claw marks, a deep ball strike and a mid-foot pressure ridge that no flat rubber fake could ever produce, because this foot had flexed as it loaded weight. The stride to the next print measured out at 57 inches, walking, not running. Something walking, relaxed, through a destroyed camp. Serenity Burke stood over that track for a long moment, and then she looked up the slope toward the high benches where the cloud sat on the mountain, and she said, quietly, like she did not want the trees to hear her, "We should not be 6. For where this is going, we should be 60. Nobody answered her, because at that exact moment, from the ridge above us, there came a knock. One single strike of wood on wood, sharp as a rifle shot, rolling down through the hollow, and from the opposite ridge, behind us, 10 seconds later, came the answer. We made the decision to push on. 2 people were out there, the dog was on scent, and daylight in October dies early in these mountains. But I radioed Ariana Larson first and asked her to pull any incident history for the Hollow Creek drainage going back 20 years. What she found, and read to me over the radio in that careful glass-stepping voice, should have turned us around right then. 1989, Hunter reports a screaming man on the bench. Search finds nothing. Hunter never hunts again. 2003, 2 camps abandoned in one weekend, gear left standing. Both parties hiked out at night without packs and refused to return for their equipment. 2011, a timber survey crew requests reassignment after, and I am quoting the file, repeated rock-throwing incidents from an unseen party. The file noted that some of the rocks weighed over 20 pounds and had come from above, down a slope no human could have climbed in the time available. And then, 2017. A trapper named Eric Carpenter, 43 years old now, found wandering the fire road at dawn, hypothermic, his rifle gone, saying one sentence over and over. "It let me leave, it let me leave, it let me leave." Eric Carpenter still lived in the county. Adam Wheeler knew him. While the rest of the team worked the scent line up the bench, Adam raised him on a borrowed cell signal from a knob with line of sight to town. And what Carpenter said came back to us secondhand, in Adam's flat mountain voice, while the cloud thickened around us. "He says you are in the nursery," Adam told us. "He says the big male runs the ridges from Hollow Creek to the Sand Lick drainage, and most years it just moves people along, knocks, rocks, the smell. He says you feel watched because you are watched every minute, and the watching is the warning." But he says in the falls when the beechnut crop fails, like this fall, they come down lower, and the male gets, and this is his word, jealous, jealous of the ground. He said one more thing, and then he hung up. What thing? Gabriella asked. Adam looked at the six of us, and at the dog, who was standing stiff-legged, staring uphill into the fog with his hackles in a ridge from collar to tail. He said, "Do not knock back, whatever you do. It is never a game to them. It is a census." We climbed through the afternoon. The forest changed around us in ways I struggled to put into words. Beech and oak gave way to spruce, and the spruce stood too close together, and the light under them came down green and thin, like light through pond water. The birds were gone, not quiet, gone. In 11 years I had never stood in an Appalachian forest in October and heard nothing. The silence had a pressure to it, a held breath quality, and every one of us felt it, because we stopped talking without ever agreeing to. At 3 we passed the old Hollow Creek fire tower, decommissioned since the 80s, its cab long gone and its steel legs rust-bitten and streaked. Adam Wheeler stopped at its base and stood looking up through the dead stairwell for a long moment, and then he told us something he had carried for 40 years, and he told it in the tone of a man finally setting down a heavy pack. 1981, he said. I was up a pole on the Sandlick line, dead of winter, replacing a transformer. 80 feet up with my hooks in, alone, my partner down at the truck with the heater running like the lazy son he was, and the pole started to move, not sway. Poles sway. I knew sway like I knew my wife's voice. This was rhythmic. Something at the base was pushing it, testing it, the way you test a fence post with your shoulder. I looked down past my own boots, and I saw the top of its head. The top, you understand, from 80 feet foreshortened, I could still tell that the shoulders were wrong, wider than the truck's tailgate, and the arms were around my pole, and it was looking up at me, and we stayed like that, it looking up and me looking down, for what my partner later swore was 11 minutes, though for me it was a year. Then it stopped pushing. It patted the pole twice, like you would pat a horse, and it walked off into the spruce, and I climbed down, and I drove home, and I never told one living soul until right now, because right now is the first time it would do anybody any good to hear it. Why did it stop? Gabriella asked him. Adam looked up at the dead tower one more time. I have had 40 years to think on that, he said, and the best I have is this. It figured out I could not come down while it was there. It figured out it was the reason, and it did not want to be the reason. He shouldered his pack. Whatever is up on that bench took 2 grown people out of a camp without leaving 1 drop of blood. You hold on to that. There has never been 1 drop of blood, not in 81, not in any file your dispatcher read you. Whatever else it is careful with us. The question I cannot answer is what happens the first time we make careful impossible. A quarter mile past the tower, Serenity Burke found the handprint. It was on a beech, because beech holds bark smooth as paper, and people carved their small names into it, and something else had pressed its mark instead. Mud and crushed lichen, a palm and 5 fingers, at a height on the trunk that I measured with my trekking pole and then measured again because I did not accept the first number. 9 feet. 4 inches, to the base of the palm. The hand itself spanned the trunk. My own hand, laid inside the print without touching, looked like a child's hand laid in a father's. The fingers had dragged slightly downward as they left the bark, 4 faint trails in the lichen, casual, the gesture of something that touches trees the way we touch banisters, and on the ground at the base of the beech, pressed into the leaf litter, the 19-inch tracks went on, north, the 57-inch stride never breaking, never hurrying, leading up into the cloud exactly along the line we had to walk. At 4 in the afternoon, Ridge quit. I do not mean he lost the scent. Madeline Dean was clear about that, and she knew her dog the way I know my own hands. He had the scent strong, she said, the strongest she had ever seen him pull, and then he walked 3 more steps, sat down in the middle of the trail, and refused. She gave him the find command. He looked at her, and this dog loved her. This dog had crawled into a collapsed well shaft for her, and he lay down flat on the trail and began to shake. He was not quitting on the scent, Madeline said. Her face had gone pale around the mouth. He was quitting on me. He is telling me he will not take me to where this goes. Jason Arnold unsnapped the strap on his sidearm, which against what was up there was about as useful as a bee sting, though none of us fully understood that yet. We took a knee in the trail and had it out in low voices. Turn back and lose the light, and maybe lose Tyler Berry and Bella Matthews to their 4th night of frost. or push to the high camp at Raven Bench, defensible open ground, and search the benches at first light. I made the call. I made it. Whatever came after sits on me. We pushed on, and behind us, where the trail bent out of sight, something heavy stepped on a log, and the log rolled, and the sound of it followed us up the mountain like a door closing. We reached Raven Bench at last light. It is a natural shelf of open grass below a sandstone cap, and it is the only place on that mountain where the trees stand back far enough to see anything coming. We strung the tents in a tight ring, built the fire bigger than regulation, and set a watch rotation. 2 awake at all times. I want to pause here, because what happened on that bench is the reason you are hearing this story at all. Most of you listening right now have not touched that like button, and you have not left a single word in the comments. I can see the numbers, and the numbers say you are sitting there silent in the gloom, exactly like we sat on that bench. Break the silence, hit the like, and tell me in the comments what you would have done when the screaming started, because I genuinely want to know. Now back to the fire, because the fire is where it found us. The first scream came at 9:40 in the evening, from the spruce wall north of the bench. I have heard mountain lions. I have heard red foxes, barred owls, elk and rut, a moose dying in a frozen lake. I have an audio library in my skull of every sound these mountains make, and I had no file for this. It started low, like a man groaning under a weight, and it climbed, through registers no human throat reaches, into a shriek with a structure in it, rising and falling in pattern, and the pattern is what undid us, because patterns mean language. It went on for 11 seconds. The volume of it pressed on the chest like a hand. Ridge urinated where he lay, and did not even lift his head. Then the second scream answered from the south, behind us, and we understood the bench was not defensible at all. It was a table, and we were set at it. Gabriella and I had the middle watch, and the middle watch is when the breathing started. We sat back to back on a flat stone with the fire banked between us and the north tree line, and somewhere out in that wall of spruce, closer than the screams had been, something very large was breathing. Slow and deep and even, a bellows rhythm, the kind of respiration that belongs to an animal with a chest you could sleep inside. It was not labored, and it was not stalking. It was the breathing of something at rest, something that had pulled up a chair. The smell arrived with it, riding a faint downslope drift of night air. I had caught edges of it for a month on the switchbacks, but at full strength it was a physical event, sour and rank, and underneath that, strangely, something green, crushed ferns and creek mud, an animal that lived in the wet places and wore them. Gabriella pressed her shoulder blades harder against mine and spoke without moving her head. "Patrick, how long has it been sitting there?" I checked my watch and did the math I had been avoiding. The breathing had been audible for 50 minutes. 50 minutes, 40 feet from 6 armed and terrified human beings, at rest. I have guarded camps against bears my entire career, and bears test you. They circle, they bluff, they want the food, and they weigh the risk. Nothing about that breathing was weighing anything. It carried the total relaxation of a creature to whom the concept of risk, here, on this mountain, in this lightless thicket, simply did not apply. We were the ones being permitted to sit there. The fire, the rifle across Jason's knees, the watch rotation. All of it was a child's blanket fort, and the thing in the spruce was the patient parent in the doorway, letting us have it. At one point, Gabriella did something braver than anything I saw in my smoke-jumping files when I once read her record. She spoke to it. Quietly, evenly, the voice she would use on a panicked rookie in a burnover. "We are only here for the 2 people, she said to the tree line. "We will take them and go. That is all this is." The breathing stopped. Complete silence, a held chest, for 10 seconds that took a week to cross. And then, out of the spruce, came a sound I can only describe as a door-sized hand patting the ground. Twice, slow, deliberate, exactly the cadence of Adam Wheeler's story. The pole patted like a horse, and the breathing resumed. And beside me in the firelight, Adam, who should have been sleeping, said in a voice with no bottom left in it, "It does that. That is its word. I think that is its word for easy. Easy now." The rocks began an hour later. Not thrown at us, understand, thrown around us. A stone the size of a loaf of bread came out of the lightless tree line in a high arc and landed dead center between the tents, thudding into the turf like a dropped anvil. Then another, off the sandstone cap, ringing it like a bell. Jason put his light on the spruce wall, and the beam shook, and I will not pretend mine was steadier. At some point past midnight, Serenity Burke, who had said maybe 10 words all day, stood up at the fire with her face to the north tree line and said, "There, above the laurel. The laurel on that edge stands 7 feet if it stands an inch. Eye shine. 2 points of it, wide set, a deep red amber, and they were a clear 2 feet above the top of the brush. 9 feet up, maybe more. They did not blink, they did not move. They regarded us is the only honest verb, the way a farmer at a fence regards his stock, counting heads, and then they were gone. No sound of departure. Nothing that big should be able to move through frost-dried laurel in total silence. And yet, Madeline Dean started laughing then, very softly, with no joy in it at all, and she said, 19 inches, 57-inch stride, 9 feet at the eyes. Patrick, what is the plan? I would love to hear the plan. I did not have one. What I had at 2 in the morning was a radio crackle, and Ariana Larson's voice coming up out of the static, careful as ever, telling me a county dispatcher had just taken a call from a landline at the Sand Lick trailhead, 11 miles north. A woman, Ariana said. She would not give a name. She said, "Tell them she is in the stick house." She said it 3 times and the line went dead. Patrick, the only structure within 8 miles of that phone is the trailhead privy. There is no stick house on any map I have. Gabriella Pierce looked at me across the fire, and the fire moved on her face, and she said what we were both thinking. Bella Matthews made that call. Which means Bella Matthews is alive, and she is north. And north is where the screaming came from first. We moved at first gray light, and the mountain let us move. And I have come to believe that this was the worst sign of all. The plan, such as it was, split us. Madeline Dean would take Ridge back down to the trailhead because the dog was finished, shaking and glassy, and a broken dog on a steep trail is a liability that gets people killed. Jason Arnold went with her, both because protocol said nobody walks out alone and because Jason, by his own quiet admission at the fire, had fired his weapon at the eye shine some hours before dawn, when a rock the size of a microwave came down through the canopy 10 feet from his tent, and his hands had not stopped trembling since. He had hit nothing. Or he had hit something, and it had not cared, and I honestly do not know which of those possibilities is worse to carry. That left 4 of us to go north along the ridgeline toward Sand Lick. Myself, Gabriella Pierce, Adam Wheeler, Serenity Burke. 11 miles of spine trail under a sky the color of dishwater, with the cloud breaking up through the morning into long ragged streamers, so that the high Appalachian sky opened and closed above us like something breathing. For the first 4 miles, nothing. Then the parallel walking began. Adam Wheeler heard it first, because Adam had spent 40 years listening to these woods from the top of utility poles. He stopped, held up one hand, and tilted his head, and then I heard it too. Downslope, perhaps 60 yards into the spruce, footfalls, heavy, unhurried, 2 beats, matching our pace. When we walked, it walked. When we stopped, it stopped, but always a half-second late, like an echo with weight. We did this dance for over an hour. Walk, stop, the lag, walk again, never a glimpse. Spruce thickets in fog hold their secrets, and this thing knew the holding to a science. It is hurting us, Serenity said at last. Her voice was level, but her knuckles on her pack straps were white. Every time the trail forks toward the drainage, it gets louder on that side. It wants us on the ridge. It is keeping us on a road of its choosing. She was right. I checked the map against every fork, and at every fork, the sounds pressed us away from the low road, away from the water, up along the bare spine. We were being driven like cattle down a chute, politely, expertly, by something that had clearly done this before, and the question none of us said out loud was the only question that mattered. A chute always ends somewhere. Chutes end at gates. Only once did the ridge route force us down, where a slide had taken out the spine trail, and the detour dropped through a hemlock ravine to a creek crossing. And what happened at that creek I have gone over 1,000 times since, frame by frame, the way you go over a car crash. The crossing was a string of flat stones over fast, shallow water, and Serenity went first, then Gabriella, then me, with Adam holding the far bank as rear guard. I was midstream, both boots on a tilted slab, when the smell hit me from upstream at a strength that made my eyes water, and I looked left, upstream, the way you look at a noise, except there had been no noise. 40 feet up the creek, standing in the water, was a juvenile. I knew it was a juvenile the way you know anything young, by the proportions, the head a fraction too big for the frame, the limbs a fraction too long, though the frame itself stood the height of a tall man, and the water that broke white around my shins broke around its calves like the creek was a puddle. It was drinking. It had been drinking, one cupped hand halfway to its mouth, and it had frozen exactly as I had frozen, midstream, mid-motion, and for 3 seconds the two of us stood in the same creek and stared at each other across 40 feet of moving water with identical expressions. I am certain of that last part. Identical. Two creatures caught somewhere they were not supposed to be seen, each waiting to learn the price. The price came as a sound from the ravine wall above us, short and low, 2 notes, and the effect on the juvenile was instant and absolute. It dropped the water from its hand, turned, and went up the far side of the ravine, a near vertical face of root and rock that a fit climber would want a rope for. And it went up that face in 4 moves, 4, like the mountain had stairs in it that only its kind could see, and the hemlocks at the rim swallowed it, and the 2-note sound from above came once more, softer, and I did not need Eric Carpenter to translate. Every parent in every species says it the same way. Come away from there, come away. Adam crossed last and stood beside me on the bank, looking up at the rim, and what he said then is the closest thing this account has to a thesis. They have rules, Patrick, he said. Rules for us. We just walked through a kitchen where a child was eating, and somewhere up on that rim, a decision got made to let it slide. We are alive on manners we cannot even see. Try not to step on any more of them. At 2 in the afternoon we found Tyler Berry's jacket. It was folded. I need you to sit with that the way we had to, not snagged on a branch, not dropped in flight. Folded, sleeves tucked under, set on top of a flat boulder in the middle of the trail like laundry on a shelf, with a fist-sized white quartz stone placed on top to keep the wind off it. Gabriella lifted the stone and unfolded the jacket and went through the pockets, and in the inside zip pocket she found Tyler's phone, screen shattered, and his lighter, and a note written on the back of a trail map in the same handwriting from the register book. The neat hand gone fully ragged now, the letters tall and shaking. It moves us at night. B hurt her ankle. It does not let us go down, only along. It brought us food. I think the sounds are names. If anyone finds this, we are not lost. We are kept. We are kept. I have read thousands of pages of incident reports in my career, and no 4 words have ever sat on my chest like those 4 words. The light began to fail us around 5, the way it does up there in late October. Not setting so much as draining, the gloom rising up out of the hollows like water filling a basin, while the high sky still held a cold blue glow. And in that last hour of useful light, the ridge trail bent around a sandstone outcrop, and Adam Wheeler, walking point, stopped so abruptly that I walked into his pack. Below us, in a natural bowl where a spring seep kept a stand of hemlock green and old, stood the stick house. I will describe it plainly and you may make of it what you wish. Imagine a dome, perhaps 10 feet at the crown, built of interlocked saplings and broken limbs, some of them 8 inches thick, bent and woven the way a person weaves a basket, except that bending a green 8-inch beech trunk into an arc requires a force I cannot put a number to. The weave was tight. It was thatched over with hemlock boughs, layered shingle fashion, shedding the wet. There was an opening on the east side, low and wide, and the ground before that opening was packed bare and shining, the way ground gets packed only by long, repeated, heavy use. It was not a deadfall. It was not a storm tangle. I have seen 10,000 storm tangles. This was made, and it was maintained, and it was old. And from inside it, in the failing light, a voice we knew from a permit photo and a folded jacket called out, cracked and small and disbelieving, "Is someone there? Please. Please be real this time." Bella Matthews crawled out of the opening on her hands and one knee, her left ankle wrapped in strips of her own base layer, her face hollowed out by 4 days of fear, and she got one look at Gabriella's uniform and made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Relief and horror in the same broken note. We got water into her, and sugar, and a space blanket, and while Serenity worked on the ankle, Bella talked, fast and flat, the way people talk when they have rehearsed the words alone for days to keep from coming apart. "It took the camp on the first night," she said. "Not attacked, took. It stood at the edge of the firelight for an hour first, just breathing. The breathing was the worst part, like a horse, but slower, and it came from up. The breathing came from up. Tyler threw a burning branch, and it caught the branch. Out of the air. It caught it, and it held the fire up, and looked at it, and then it looked at us, and it put the fire out in its fist. and it was so unbothered, that is the word, unbothered, like nothing we could ever do would ever matter to it. It had moved them at night, she said, exactly as the note described, always along the ridges, never down. It had brought them things, mushrooms, a dead grouse neatly cracked open. Once, unbearably, a hubcap, shining and absurd, set down before their shelter like a gift, like an offering from its world to theirs. It made sounds at them, the same rising falling structures we had heard at Raven Bench, patient, repeated, and Bella said the thing that broke her was the day she realized the sounds were repeating in the same order every time, and that it would pause after, and wait, and tilt its head. It was teaching us, she said, or it was asking us something, the same question, over and over, and we could not answer, and I think the not answering made it sad. Do you understand? I watched it be sad. It sat down at the edge of the clearing one whole evening with a sapling in its hands, peeling it, not eating, just peeling, and it had its back to us, and the back of it was sad. Nobody will ever believe me, and I do not care anymore. Where is Tyler? Gabriella asked her gently, the way you ask a question whose answer you fear. Bella's face did not crumble. It went still, which was worse. 2 nights ago it came in a hurry, she said. Everything before had been slow, and that night it came fast, and there were knocks all around us, more than one of them. There have always been more than one of them, and it picked Tyler up. The way you pick up a child off a road when a truck is coming. It looked at me, and it made the smallest sound it ever made, almost no sound at all, and then it went north with him, and the others went with it, all those footsteps going north around me in the night, and then nothing. It left me by the phone box trail, and it built that over me in one night. She gestured at the dome without looking at it. I think the house means safe. I think I was put somewhere safe. I keyed the radio to call it in, and got static, not dead air, static with a rhythm in it, rising and falling, and I want very much to believe that was the mountain, and the weather, and the iron in the rock. I have to tell you the truth, though, because that is the deal between us. The rhythm in that static matched the screams, note for note. We could not carry Bella and search for Tyler in the night, and we could not leave anyone behind, and so we did the only thing left. We moved north toward the Sand Lick trailhead, 4 searchers and a casualty on an improvised crutch, 2 miles of descending fire road between us and a vehicle, with the last light gone out of the high sky and the woods on either side standing like a held breath. They came with us the whole way down. I am past pretending otherwise. Footfalls flanking both sides of the road, multiple sets, heavy and soft together, the way a family moves, big strides and small ones. Once, off to the left, something young made a sound, a short curling whoop with a question mark in it, and something enormous answered it with a single low tone, and the young one went quiet, and every hair on my body stood up, because I have done exactly that with my own son in church. The tone was not a threat, the tone was hush. Adam Wheeler walked next to me with his light off, by choice, and he said, very low, "They are seeing us out." Like walking the drunk to the porch and watching until the door shuts. We are almost to the porch, Patrick. Do not do anything that stops us being walked to the porch. The fire road came around a final bend, and there, 400 feet ahead, was the gate. A steel pipe gate across the road, the trailhead lot beyond it, and beyond that, impossibly ordinary, the pale rectangle of the phone box where a kept woman had begged a dispatcher to be believed. Jason Arnold's truck sat in the lot. They had made it down. 2 headlights, 200 yards, an entire other universe where things weighed what they were supposed to weigh, and between us and the gate, it stepped out onto the road. I have given you measurements this whole account, because measurements are the handrail I hold. Here is the last one. The steel gate posts at Sand Lick are 6 feet high. It stood beside the post, and the post reached its thigh. The shoulders filled the road the way a loaded log truck fills the road. It did not crouch, and it did not display, and it did not make one single sound. It stood in the open for the first time in 5 days, lit faintly from behind by the trailhead's lone sodium lamp, a silhouette with depth, with breath, the chest moving slow, the arms hanging past the knees, the head set forward on the shoulders under a ridge of crown. And it looked at us, and the looking had weight. The looking was a hand placed flat against the 5 of us. Nobody screamed. I want that on the record. Bella Matthews stood on her one good leg between Gabriella and Serenity, and she did not scream. She whispered, and what she whispered was, "Tyler is not with them. Count." There were always 5. Tonight there are 4. She was right. Up the slope on our left, 3 more stood among the trunks, smaller, one of them very small, watching. 4, with the giant on the road, and no man between them. The giant raised its right arm. Slowly, the way you move around a spooked horse, it lifted that arm. And in its fist, swallowed by its fist, was Tyler Berry's red knit cap. And it leaned, the whole tonnage of it leaned with a tenderness that has broken something in me permanently, and it set the cap down on the gravel of the road. It pressed the cap once with 2 fingers, flat, the way you press a thing to say it stays, the way you press a thing to say, settled, done, kept. Then it spoke. I will call it speaking until someone gives me a better word. The rising falling structure, soft this time, almost under its breath. 3 phrases, a pause, the head tilting, the amber eyes on me specifically, and I understood with total clarity that I was being asked the same question 2 terrified hikers had been asked for 4 nights, and that I had one chance to answer it, and no language to answer it in. So I did the only thing I had. God forgive me if it was wrong. I took my flashlight, and I knelt, slowly, and I set the flashlight on the gravel of the fire road, lit, pointing at the night sky, and I pressed it once with 2 fingers, flat, yours, settled, kept. For 3 full seconds, nothing in those mountains moved. Then the giant exhaled, one long horse breath that I felt on my face from 30 feet away, and it turned, without hurry, taking its weight off the road the way a tide takes itself off a beach, and it walked up into the trees, and the others fell in around it, biggest to smallest, and the very smallest one stopped at the tree line and looked back at us and knocked once on a trunk before the woods folded over them all. We walked to the gate. We did not run. To this day I could not tell you why we did not run, except that running felt like the wrong answer to the question. Epilogue. The report. Tyler Berry came out of the sand-licked drainage at dawn, 9 hours later, 4 miles north of where we stood at the gate. A bow hunter found him walking the creek bed, hypothermic, dehydrated, his ankle sprained, alive. He has no memory he is willing to share of his last 3 days. He said exactly 1 sentence to me in the hospital corridor, holding his red cap in both hands like a man holding a passport from a country no one believes in. They argued about me, he said, at the end. The big one and the gray one argued, and the big one won, and what the big one wanted was to give me back. Patrick, it argued for me. The official file says black bear, anomalous behavior, complicated by severe weather and searcher fatigue. The 17 cameras on the Hollow Creek Ridge were collected for maintenance the following week by an office I had never heard of, and their cards were never returned, and the man who signed for them had a federal badge with no agency name I recognized, and a smile that never reached his eyes. The stick house at Sand Lick burned in November. Lightning, the file says. There was no storm in November. Madeline Dean retired her dog. Jason Arnold transferred to a courthouse posting, and we do not speak of it, and that is fine. Both of us are saying everything we need to say by not speaking of it. Eric Carpenter, when I finally drove out to his place with a bottle, listened to all of it in silence, and at the end he asked 1 question. "Did you answer it?" he said. And when I told him about the flashlight, the old trapper put his face in his hands, and when he looked up he was crying, and he said, 20 years I have wondered what I should have done, and a flashlight. It just wanted an answer, any answer, it just wanted to be answered. I still work the Black Fern District. I closed Hollow Creek and the Skyline Bench to overnight use, citing trail erosion, and my supervisors signed it without 1 question, and I noticed they signed it fast. But here is the thing I actually came here to tell you. The thing that keeps me sitting up at the window in the small hours while my family sleeps. Last week the cameras went back up on the ridge. New office, new study, bird migration, the paperwork says. 17 new cameras in the old 17 places, and 4 nights ago, every single one of them was found turned to face the sky, except one. One camera, the one nearest Raven Bench, was turned to face down the mountain, toward the town, toward the porch lights, and set on the ground in front of its lens, pressed flat into the mud, settled, kept, was a flashlight. It was still on. Something walked out of the tree line behind Ranger Station 9 at 3 in the morning, and it carried Mark Little under one arm the way a man carries firewood. I watched it happen through the window. I had a rifle in my hands, and I never raised it, because the thing turned its head and looked at me through the glass, and in that moment I understood that the rifle was a joke, that the station walls were a joke, that everything I believed about these mountains was a joke it had been telling us for 200 years. Mark was still alive when it took him. I know because he was screaming my call sign into the night, over and over, until the trees swallowed the sound. That was 11 days ago. They never found him. They never will. And before this story is over, you are going to understand why I resigned, why I burned my uniform in a steel barrel behind my house, and why I will never set foot in the Nantahala High Country again as long as I live. I have been a ranger in the southern Appalachians for 19 years. I am going to tell you everything in order, because the order matters. The Cherokee people who lived in these mountains long before any of us had a name for what walked out of those trees. They carved warnings into stone. We called it folklore. We were wrong. It started in the first week of October, when the leaves on the high ridges were turning to rust and gold, and the tourist season was winding down to its last gasp. My district covered a remote corner of the National Forest in western North Carolina, hard against the Cherokee land, a country of deep coves and laurel hells and ridgelines that stay wrapped in cloud for days at a time. It is beautiful country. It is also country that does not forgive mistakes, and every ranger who works it learns a respect for the terrain that borders on superstition. My supervisor at the time was a man named Colin Austin, 47 years old, a career Forest Service man with a gray mustache and a habit of chewing on the stem of an unlit pipe when he was thinking. On the morning of October 4th, he called me into the district office and slid a map across the desk. There was a red circle drawn around a drainage called Wolfpen Branch, a steep and trailless basin about 9 miles from the nearest road. A hiker had gone missing up there. Her name was Valentina Hansen, 48, an experienced backpacker out of Asheville who had filed a trip plan, carried a satellite beacon, and done everything right. Her beacon had fired one distress signal at 2 in the morning on October 2nd, transmitted for 90 seconds, and then gone silent. Not low battery silent, destroyed silent. The signal cut off in the middle of a transmission burst, which the manufacturer told us almost never happens unless the unit is physically crushed. Colin wanted me to lead the ground search because I knew Wolfman better than anyone in the district. I had been in there maybe a dozen times over the years, mostly chasing bear poachers, and I will tell you honestly that I never liked the place. The basin sits in permanent shade under a wall of cliffs. The timber in the bottom is old growth that was never logged because no sane man would try to haul timber out of there, and the whole drainage has a hush to it, a held breath quality that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. We went in on October 5th with a team of 6, myself, 2 seasonal rangers, and 3 volunteers from the county rescue squad, including a retired tracker named Richard Schultz, 51, who had found more lost hikers in those mountains than any man alive. We located Valentina Hansen's camp by noon, and that is when the entire shape of my life began to bend toward the thing at the window. The camp was wrong. I have worked dozens of search and rescue operations, and I have seen camps abandoned in panic, camps hit by bears, camps scattered by storms. This was none of those. Her tent had not been torn open. It had been peeled the way you peel an orange. The rain fly in the tent body pulled apart at the seams in long, deliberate strips and laid out flat on the ground in a pattern that was almost orderly. Her backpack hung from a branch 11 feet off the ground, not snagged, hung by the haul loop on a broken stub of limb that pointed straight up. Richard stood under that pack for a long time with his hat in his hands. He said, "I cannot reach that. You cannot reach that. A black bear does not do that." Then he stopped talking, and he did not say much for the rest of the day. We found her boots 40 yards from the tent, side by side, laces still tied, placed neatly at the base of a white oak as if she had stepped out of them and ascended. We never found Valentina Hansen. What we found, pressed into the soft black soil of the creek bank, heading uphill into the laurel where no human being could walk upright, was a line of bare footprints. Each one was 22 inches long. The stride between them was over 6 feet. And the depth of the prints, in soil where my own boots sank barely an inch, told a story about weight that I did not allow myself to do the arithmetic on until much later, alone, with the lights on. Richard knelt by the clearest print for almost 10 minutes. When he finally stood up, he looked older. He said one word. He said, "Again." I asked him what he meant by that, and he looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked where people go when they die, and he said, "This is not the first time I have seen this track. 1968, Snowbird Mountains, when I was a boy. The old men filled that print in with dirt and told us never to speak about it. Then he walked back down the creek, and he quit the rescue squad 2 weeks later, and to this day he will not return my calls. The official report listed Valentina Hansen as missing, presumed dead, probable cause animal predation. I wrote a separate memo describing the prints and the hung backpack and the peeled tent, and Colin Austin read it in front of me, folded it in half and put it in his desk drawer instead of the case file. He was not angry, he was tired. He said, "You have been here 19 years and you have never pulled a file from before your time. Maybe it is time you did." Then he gave me a key to the records room in the basement of the old district building, the one that smells of mildew and kerosene, and he told me to look at anything with a green tab. There were 11 green tabbed files. The oldest was from 1952. The newest was from 6 years before I was hired. 11 people, all of them lost in the same 20 square miles of high country between Wolfpen Branch and the Cherokee boundary. All of them experienced in the backwoods, and every single file contained some version of the same impossible details written in the careful flat language of men who knew nobody would believe them. Gear placed in trees beyond human reach, boots left side by side, tracks in soil and snow, barefoot, between 18 and 24 inches, always leading uphill into terrain that search teams could not follow. One file from 1961 included a photograph, black and white, curling at the edges. It showed a handprint on the hood of a Forest Service truck. The officer had laid his own hand inside it for scale. His hand looked like a child's. The last page of that file was a handwritten note from a ranger long dead. It said, "The Cherokee at Big Cove will not work in this drainage. They say it belongs to the slant-eyed giant, the master of the game, the one their grandmothers called Sulkaloo. They say he tolerates us at the low elevations and takes what he wants from the high ones, and that the taking is not malice, it is rent." I am not a superstitious man, but I drove out to the Qualla boundary on my next day off because there was one name that appeared in 3 of those 11 files as a consultant, and that name was Bowman. The woman who answered the door was Rose Bowman, 54 years old, a teacher of the Cherokee language and the granddaughter of the man the old rangers used to call when the green tab cases happened. She did not seem surprised to see my uniform. She made coffee, and she let me talk myself empty. And when I finished describing the 22-inch prints, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me a question I did not expect. She asked, "Did it fold anything?" I said I did not understand. She said, "The tent. Did it take the tent apart and lay it out flat?" I had not told her that detail. I had not told anyone that detail outside the memo in Colin Austin's drawer. The coffee cup was shaking in my hand, and I set it down. Rose told me about Sulkaloo the way you tell someone about a difficult relative, with weariness instead of wonder. She said the stories the tourists hear are wrong. He is not a spirit. He is not a ghost story told around fires. He is a being of flesh that her people have shared these mountains with since before memory. The great lord of the hunt who lives in the high places, and the carvings on the soapstone boulder the white people call Judicula Rock are not art. They are a boundary marker, a property line. She said her grandmother put it plainly. Below the rock, the land is yours. Above the rock, you are livestock that has not been gathered yet. I asked her why it would take a hiker who did everything right. Rose looked out her kitchen window toward the wall of mountains in the east, and she said, "October. He gathers in October, before the deep cold. He has always gathered in October. Your 11 files in the basement. Check the dates." I did, that same night, with the records room door locked behind me. All 11 disappearances fell between the 1st and the 19th of October. Valentina Hansen vanished on October 2nd. As I sat there on the concrete floor with those folders spread around me, my radio crackled on the county channel, and a voice I knew. A seasonal ranger named Blake George, 49, calm by training but not calm now, reported that 2 bear hunters were overdue out of the Wolfpen quadrant, and that their dogs had come back to the truck alone. The dogs would not stop shivering. One of them had gone white around the muzzle, the handler swore, overnight. The date on my watch read October 9th. I want you to stop for 1 second, because we are about to go up that mountain together, and there is no easy way back after this point. If this story has held you this far, and you have not yet pressed the like button or said a word in the comments, this is the moment to do it, while your hands are still steady. Because what the hunters left behind in that clearing is the part of this account that I still cannot say out loud without standing up and turning on every light in the room. The 2 overdue hunters were Stephen Lawson, 53, and Mark Little, 55, local men who had run bear dogs in that country their whole lives. Their truck was parked at the end of a gated logging road on the northeast rim of the Wolfpen Basin. and by the time I arrived just after dawn on October 10th, Blake George had already taped off the area around the tailgate, because the tailgate was the first wrong thing. It was bent. Not dented, the way a tree strike or a careless driver dents steel. Bent downward in the middle, folded almost to the bumper, with two smooth depressions in the metal at the points of pressure, as if something had leaned its weight on the back of that truck the way a man leans on a fence rail to look at cattle. The depressions were the size of dinner plates. Inside one of them, pressed into the paint, was the texture of skin. Not fur, skin, with ridges and creases, like an enormous palm. We followed the dog tracks backward from the truck, which is a strange thing to do, tracking the retreat instead of the advance, and the story the ground told us got worse with every quarter mile. The dogs had come down off that mountain in a straight line. Dogs do not move in straight lines. Dogs flow around obstacles, they quarter, they follow scent. These tracks ran through briar tangles that the dogs would normally have skirted, through a creek at its widest crossing instead of its narrowest, in a dead straight line pointed at the truck, and the stride length said they had been running flat out for over 2 miles. Something had frightened those animals so completely that the oldest instincts in them, the ones that say save your strength and protect your feet, had been burned away by a single overriding command. Away, away, away. 4 miles up, at the head of a hanging valley, right at the edge of the old growth, we found the clearing. And I am going to describe it to you carefully and slowly, because I wrote it down that night while it was fresh, and I have read that page so many times since that the paper has gone soft at the folds. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, ringed in old hemlocks, floored in moss. In the center of it, the hunter's gear was arranged. That is the only word, arranged. 2 rifles, unloaded, the cartridges standing upright in the moss beside them in 2 neat rows like little brass soldiers. 2 packs, emptied. The contents sorted by kind, food in one pile, clothing in another, rope and knives and metal things in a third. Every pile was orderly, every pile was deliberate. Whatever did this had sat in that clearing, in no hurry at all, and gone through the possessions of 2 grown men the way a customs officer goes through luggage. And it had been curious about some things and indifferent to others. A box of chocolate bars had been opened, each bar unwrapped, the wrappers smoothed flat and stacked. The chocolate itself was untouched, lined up on a log in the sun, melting, and on the trunk of the largest hemlock at the edge of the clearing, beginning at a height of 9 feet and ending at a height of perhaps 14, the bark had been raked away by something with 5 points in long vertical strokes, and the exposed wood was bleeding sap. Blake stood looking up at those marks with his hand resting on his sidearm, which was a reflex and a useless one, and he said quietly, "That is fresh, that is since the dew." And the woods around us were silent in a way I had never heard. Understand that a mountain forest in October is never silent. There are always squirrels working the mast, jays scolding, woodpeckers, wind. That valley was a held breath. Every living thing that could leave had left, and the things that could not leave were hiding. And the silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that all sound had agreed to avoid. We never heard it coming because there was nothing to hear. There was only the smell, sudden and total, rolling over the clearing like floodwater. I have smelled bear, boar, rotting deer, every foulness these mountains produce. This was none of them. This was wet earth and crushed herbs and musk, and something underneath all of it like copper, like a storm about to break. And the moment it reached us, every hair on my body stood up and my legs tried to run without consulting me. From the laurel slope above the clearing, from a thicket so dense that I could not have pushed my arm into it, came a sound that I felt in the bones of my chest before my ears agreed it existed. A knock. Wood on wood, single, enormous, patient. Then a second knock from the opposite ridge, a quarter mile away, answering. 2 of them. There were 2 of them, and they were talking about us. Blake George was a steady man. He had done 2 tours overseas before the Forest Service, and I never once saw him rattled. He turned to me in that clearing with his face the color of ash and said, "We are leaving now. We are walking, not running, and we are not looking at the laurel." And we did exactly that, 4 miles downhill, in formation, while at intervals of about 10 minutes a knock would sound from the slope above us, never closer, never farther, keeping pace, escorting us off the mountain like guards walking a trespasser to the property line. At the gate, as I fumbled with the lock, one final knock came from just inside the tree line, close, no more than 60 yards, and with it a low sound that rose and fell, too long for any lungs I knew, and I will not call it a howl. A howl is animal. This had shape inside it, rhythm, intention. It was a statement, and though I will never be able to prove it, I knew with total certainty what the statement said. It said, "These two are mine. Stop looking." Stephen Lawson walked out of the forest on his own 2 days later, 11 miles from that clearing, on the far side of a ridge system that should have taken a fit man in daylight a day and a half to cross. He was barefoot, he was unhurt. There was not a scratch on him, and that detail haunted the medical staff at the county hospital more than any injury could have, because he had crossed 2 miles of briar and rockslide with bare feet that looked like he had spent the day on a beach. He did not speak for 9 days. When he finally spoke, he said only one thing, to me, because he refused to say it to anyone official. He said, "It carried me, the whole way. It carried me like I weighed nothing, and it put me down where it wanted me, facing the road, and it pushed me, gently between the shoulders. It kept Mark. It looked at us both for a long time, and it chose, and it kept Mark, and I do not know why I was the one it let go." He never hunted again. He sold his dogs that winter to a man in Tennessee, and he told the man, "Do not ever run them north of the Judaculla Rock." You would think a man walking out of the wilderness barefoot and unharmed after vanishing for 2 days would make the regional news. It did not. The official statement said Stephen Lawson became separated from his hunting partner, suffered a disorienting fall, and self-rescued. The search for Mark Little was scaled back after 1 week and suspended after 2. I sat in the meeting where that decision was made. Colin Austin did not look at me once during that meeting, and afterward, in the parking lot, he stood by my truck chewing his cold pipe and said, "There is a number in Atlanta that I am required to call when a green tab situation occurs." I called it. The instruction was the same instruction it has been since before either of us was born. Contain, conclude, close the file. He looked at the mountains for a while, and then he said something that I think about constantly. He said, "Son, we are not the wildlife management agency up there. We are the visitor management agency. We always have been. Our job is to keep the herd in the meadow and out of the high pasture, and the reason that is our job is that the high pasture already has a manager." I could not let it go. Mark Little had a wife and 2 grown daughters, and they deserved better than a closed file, and so on my own time, in my own truck, I started visiting the people whose names had surfaced again and again in the old records, and what I found was a quiet network of human beings scattered through those coves who had spent their whole lives knowing and not saying. Maya Williamson, 50 years old, ran a small farm in a valley on the southern edge of my district, the last private inholding before the forest boundary. Every October for as long as she could remember, she told me, her family had carried a portion of the fall harvest to a flat stone at the top of their highest pasture and left it there overnight. Apples, corn, a cleaned and dressed hog every 3rd year. Her grandfather called it the toll. She showed me the stone. It was swept clean, polished by generations of use, and around it in a rough circle, the grass was pressed flat in patches longer than a man is tall. She said in '94 her father got modern ideas and skipped the toll. And that winter something walked the farm every single night for a month, circling the house, leaning on the walls until the timbers groaned, breathing at the windows, never breaking in, never harming a thing, just reminding. Patient as a landlord. They paid double in the spring and it stopped. Jasmine Oliver, 52, had been a wildlife biology technician on a federal bear study in the early 2000s, hair snare stations and trail cameras across the whole high country. And she met me at a diner 2 counties away because she did not want to be seen with me. She kept her voice low and her hands around her coffee cup the whole time. She said the study collected hair samples from every station except the 7 stations inside the Wolfpen Quadrant. Those 7 stations were destroyed, all of them, repeatedly, and not by bears. The steel posts were pulled from the ground and driven, points first, into the trunks of trees, 8 and 9 feet up. The cameras were never smashed. They were turned around, every time, to face the trunk they were mounted on. Something up there understood what a camera was, understood what it was for, and declined. One single camera, before it was turned, captured 3 frames at 2 in the morning. She saw them before they went up the chain and disappeared. I asked her what was on them. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "A shoulder. 1 frame of a shoulder, in motion, at the edge of the frame. The shoulder was higher than the camera, and the camera was mounted at 8 feet. And the strange thing, she said, the thing that made her resign her position and move to town and never go past the pavement again, was not the size. It was that in the third frame, the very edge of a face was entering the picture, turning toward the lens. It knew the camera had fired. It heard the shutter from however far away, in the deep of night, and it was coming back to correct the error. She said, the face was not an animal face. I have classified every large mammal in these mountains. There was a forehead, there was thought behind it. It was nobody's animal, and it was nobody's man, and it was already 3 steps ahead of a federal study with a budget in the millions. And then there was the historian. Blake Burke, 46, taught at the community college and had spent 15 years collecting settlement-era documents from the region. And when I told him what I was carrying around inside me, he did not laugh. He opened a fireproof cabinet and laid letters in front of me. Original paper, brown as autumn leaves. A survey crew journal from 1837 describing their Cherokee guides refusing payment of any amount to chain the high line past a certain ridge, saying the owner of that ground had not been consulted. A preacher's letter from 1851 asking his bishop for guidance because a family in his congregation left food on a mountain altar and he could not convince them it was sin, for they claimed they had seen the receiver of the offering and that it stood as tall as the cabin door and a half again, and that it had watched their children at play with what the mother swore was gentleness. And a single page from a county ledger, 1888, recording payment to 2 men for the burial of a third, with a note in the margin in a clerk's tight hand, found above Judah Cullah, kept by the giant 9 years by his own account, would not stay in town. Walked back up the mountain on the 3rd day and was not pursued, kept by the giant, 9 years, by his own account. I sat in Blake Burke's office with a century-old ledger in my hands, and I thought about Mark Little, and for the first time the question changed shape in my chest. I stopped asking what took him. I started asking what it was keeping him for. That was the question I carried up the mountain on the night of October 19th, the last night of the gathering season, when I broke every regulation I had sworn to uphold, loaded my pack, and went into the Wolfpen Basin alone, in the dim, to trade. Before I went, I drove to the Qualla boundary one last time, because going up that mountain without speaking to Rose Bowman first felt like going to court without reading the law. When I told her my plan, she did not try to stop me, which frightened me more than an argument would have. She went to her pantry and packed a cloth bundle, tobacco, cornmeal, a jar of sourwood honey, and she tied it with red thread and put it in my hands and held my hands closed around it. She said, "You do not track him. You let him find you, and he will, before you have gone a mile past the rock. You do not carry a rifle, not because it would anger him, but because it would insult him, and his contempt is more dangerous than his anger. You put the bundle on open ground, you step back 10 paces, and you wait, and whatever happens, you do not run. He has never once chased a person in all the memory of my people, but everything that runs from him gets categorized. Do you understand? The moment you run, you stop being a person to him, and you become game, and Sul Kalu has never lost game." Then she told me the last thing, the thing I have never repeated until now. She said, "If he shows you his face, do not look away. Looking away is for animals. Hold his eyes no matter what you feel. It is the only language you have that he respects, and it is the only way he will know you have come to negotiate and not to beg." I crossed the boundary of the old growth a little after midnight. I will not pretend I was brave. I had written letters to my sister and left them on my kitchen table. The forest above the rock at night is a world with its own physics. My headlamp seemed to reach half its normal distance. The beam swallowed before it touched anything, and the silence came down around me within the first mile exactly as it had in the clearing, total, attentive. A silence that was listening to me far harder than I was listening to it. He let me walk for 2 hours. I understood later that this was deliberate, that the walk itself was part of the negotiation, that he wanted me deep enough that the decision to be there could not be taken back. At a flat bench of ground beside a creek too small to have a name, the smell arrived, the wet earth and crushed green and copper, and every nerve I owned lit up at once, and from the gloom upslope came one knock, soft this time, almost courteous, an announcement, "I am here. You may begin." My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to untie my pack. I laid Rose Bowman's bundle on the moss in the open. I laid Mark Little's spare jacket beside it, taken from his truck, so there could be no confusion about what I had come to discuss. And then I stepped back 10 paces, turned off my headlamp because some instinct said the light was rude, and stood in the blackness under the hemlocks, with my heart going like a fist on a door. He came down the slope with no sound at all. 800 pounds at the very least, and the creek bank did not register him. Not a stone turned, not a stick broken. And that soundlessness was the most terrifying fact I have ever learned, because it meant every twig that ever snapped in those mountains, every knock, every print we ever found, was a choice, a message. He had been speaking to us slowly, for generations, the way you speak to something simple that you are fond of. The night was not empty. There was a half-moon somewhere above the canopy, and gray light came down through the gaps, and he stepped into one of those gaps 30 feet from me and stood still and let me see him. I am 6'1". My eyes were level with the middle of his chest. The Cherokee name describes the eyes as slanted, and the old carvings show 7 fingers, and I will tell you that the eyes did seem long and angled in that gray light, set deep under a brow like a ledge of stone. But I could not count fingers, and I would not have tried, because Rose Bowman's voice was in my head saying, "Hold his eyes," and so that is what I did. I held his eyes, and he held mine, and the creek ran between us, and I stood in the gaze of something that has owned these mountains since before my language existed. People ask what I felt, the ones I have trusted enough to tell. They expect me to say terror, and there was terror, but terror was the smallest part. What I felt, under the gaze of that face, that heavy, patient, thinking face, was the sensation of being read. He went through me the way he had gone through the hunter's packs, item by item, sorting my contents into piles, and I felt with absolute certainty that he could see the whole shape of my life. My 19 years on his border, every camper I had turned back from the high country without knowing why the rule existed, every file in that basement. And I felt him arrive at the question I had carried up the mountain, the jacket lying on the moss between us, and consider it. He looked at the jacket. He looked back at me. And then Sul Kalu, the master of the game, the keeper of the high pasture, did the thing that broke me, the thing that I cannot make peace with, the thing that proves to me that he is not an animal and never was. He shook his head, slowly, once to the left, once to the right, a gesture he did not learn from the forest, a gesture he learned from us, from 200 years of watching us, kept for the rare occasions when one of the herd walks up the mountain and asks for something back. No. The answer was no. Mark Little was not lost, and not dead, and not coming home, because Mark Little had been gathered, and the gathering is not undone. Then he picked up the bundle and the jacket, both in one hand, and he turned, and the gloom folded around him like a door closing, and the last I saw of him was that high-shouldered Jasmine Oliver had described, sliding through a gap in the moonlight 9 feet off the ground, unhurried, the lord of the place walking his own land. I stood by that creek until the bird started before dawn, because the bird starting meant he had truly gone, and then I walked down out of the high country with my empty pack, and I have told you what I went up there knowing. Now I have to tell you what I learned 11 days later, at 3 in the morning, at the window of Ranger Station 9, when he brought Mark Little back down the mountain to show me. I pulled the overnight shift at Station 9 on the last night of October because I asked for it. The station sits at the foot of the Wolfpen drainage, the last human light before 50 square miles of his country, and some part of me had been waiting since the night by the creek because the meeting had felt unfinished. He had answered my question. He had not yet collected his price for being asked. The motion light over the woodshed came on at 6 minutes past 3. I know the time exactly because I wrote it in the station log with a steady hand, the last steady thing I ever wrote. And then I looked out the window, and the world I had been pretending to still live in ended quietly and forever. He was standing at the edge of the tree line in the cone of the motion light, in full illumination. And that alone was a message, because a being that has avoided every camera and every light for 2 centuries does not stand in one by accident. He stood there letting me see him, and under his right arm, carried against his hip the way a man carries firewood, or the way a parent carries a tired child, was Mark Little. Mark was alive. I want to be careful here, because his family deserves care, and his wife, Eliana Lynch, 56, who kept her own name and kept the porch light burning for him every night of that October, deserves the truth and not a performance of it. Mark was alive, and he was clean, and he was dressed in his own clothes, and he had no wounds, and he had been gone 20 days in country where a man without equipment dies in 3. He was being kept, and he was being kept well, the way Maya Williamson's family kept their stock, with attention, with competence, with something that was not love, but was not far from it. The giant walked him forward into the open ground between the shed and the station, 30 yards from my window, and set him down on his feet in the wet grass, and stepped back one pace, and waited. And I understood, with the rifle useless in my hands, that this was the second half of the negotiation. By the creek he had told me no. Now he had carried his no down the mountain, 20 days of feeding and keeping under one arm, to show me that no was not cruelty. Look, he is whole, he is warm. He is mine, and I keep what is mine in good condition. Stop looking for him. Mark turned and saw me in the window. And here is the wound I will carry into the ground, the detail I have never said aloud until this recording. Mark Little did not run toward the station. There was nothing holding him. The giant stood a full pace behind him, arms loose, posture soft, and the door was 30 yards away, and Mark looked at that door and looked at me behind the glass, and his face was not the face of a prisoner. It was the face of a man standing at the rail of a ship, watching a harbor he used to live in slide past, distant, resigned. Almost, and this is the word that broke Ileana when I finally told her, almost embarrassed. He raised one hand to me, not waving for help, just raising it, the way you raise a hand to a neighbor when you are driving out of town for the last time. Then he turned around on his own and walked back to the giant, and the giant gathered him up under one arm. And only then, only at the very last moment, as the gloom came down off the trees to meet them, did whatever was left of the old Mark Little surface for one breath. He began to scream. He screamed my call sign, my number, the code that meant Ranger needs assistance, over and over into the night. And the screaming was not aimed at me, I realized later. It was not a request. It was a goodbye in the only vocabulary the mountain had left him, and the trees took the sound, and the motion light timed out, and the dim stood empty. And I was alone with a rifle I had never raised, and a logbook open to an entry I had no language to finish. They found my resignation letter on Colin Austin's desk the next morning, under my badge. He never asked me a single question. He took the green tab files down to his truck himself, one box at a time, and I do not know where they went, and I have stopped wondering, because I understand the policy now. I sat in the meetings, I read the files, I called it a cover-up, and I was wrong. It is not a cover-up, it is a treaty. The oldest treaty on this continent, older than the country, older than the Cherokee themselves by Rose Bowman's own telling, and the terms have never changed. The low country is ours, the high country is his. And once a season, in the gathering month, the rent comes due, and it has always come due, and the 11 green tabs in that basement were not failures of search and rescue. They were payments, processed. I live in the flatlands now, east of the mountains, where the horizon does not have shoulders. Stephen Lawson calls me on the anniversary every year, and we say almost nothing. Two men holding a telephone, breathing, keeping each other company across the one fact nobody else will sit with us inside. Ileana Lynch sold the house. Before she left, she did one thing that I think about more than anything else in this story. She drove up the gated road as far as her car would go, and she carried a box to the boundary of the old growth, and in the box was Mark's coat for the deep cold, and his reading glasses, and a photograph of their daughters, and she left it on open ground and stepped back 10 paces, the way I taught her, and she said out loud, "He gets cold in February. His chest. You keep him warm in February, or you answer to me." And then she held the gloom under those trees with her eyes. No weapon, no light. A 56-year-old woman correcting the largest predator in the Western Hemisphere on the care of her husband. And she did not look away, and she walked back to her car, and she drove east, and never returned. The box was gone the next morning. A hiker I trust checked. In its place, set in the center of the flattened grass, was a single river stone, smooth and round and chosen, the kind a child gives you, the kind that means received. If you take anything out of this account, take this. The trail closures in the high Appalachians are not about erosion. The boundaries are older than the signs. When you stand at an overlook in October and the forest below you goes quiet all at once, all of it, every bird, every squirrel, in a single second, like a held breath, you are not noticing weather, you are being counted. Most of you will be left in the meadow. Some of you, the strong ones, the capable ones, the ones who do everything right, are being considered. Stay below the rock, pay attention to which trails the old families will not walk. And if you ever wake in your tent in the gathering month to a single knock, wood on wood, patient and enormous, do not run, do not beg, and do not believe for one moment that you are alone in this world at the top of anything at all. We are not the owners of the high country. We are the herd in the meadow, and the meadow has always had a fence, and the fence has always had a keeper, and the keeper of the game does not lose game. Salkaloo keeps what he gathers. And somewhere above Wolfpen Branch tonight, in the deep timber where no camera will ever fire twice, Mark Little is warm, and Valentina Hansen walks barefoot without bleeding, and the master of that ground watches the lights of our towns come on in the valleys below, the way a farmer at his gate watches the lamps of his neighbor, with patience, with ownership, and with all the time in the world. There is one more thing, and then I am done, and you can decide for yourselves what to do with all of this. Last spring, an envelope arrived at my house in the Flatlands with no return address and a Cherokee, North Carolina postmark. Inside was a photocopy of a page from a ledger I recognized, the county ledger from 1888. The entry about the man kept 9 years who walked back up the mountain on the third day. Someone had written a single line beneath it in pencil, in a hand I did not know. It said, "They always go back up, every one of them, in the whole history of the record. The ones he releases pace the floors of their houses for a season, and stop sleeping in beds, and stop eating at tables, and one morning their families wake to an open door, and the searchers find one set of boot prints heading uphill past the rock, and after the rock, no prints at all, because after the rock he carries them, and they let him. I tell you that because of Stephen Lawson, because on our last call, on the anniversary, there was something new in his voice, a calm I had not heard in him since before the clearing, and when I asked him how he was sleeping, he was quiet for a long while, and then he said, 'You know, it is a funny thing. I have started sleeping with the window open, even in the cold. The air down here in town tastes like nothing. And some nights, when the wind comes off the mountains just right, I can smell it again, the wet earth and the crushed green, all the way down here, 20 miles from the boundary. And I know that is not possible, and I know what it means anyway. It means he checks on us, the ones he let go. He keeps track of his whole herd, near and far, and he is patient, and October always comes back around. I have not opened a window in my house in 2 years. I keep the mountains at my back when I drive. But I am going to be honest with you here at the end, because you have stayed with me this long and you have earned the whole truth. Some nights I dream of the high pasture above Wolfpen Branch, the moss and the hemlocks and the held breath silence, and in the dream I am not afraid. In the dream the silence is not a warning, it is a welcome, and every year, when the leaves on the far ridges start turning to rust and gold, I catch myself standing in my yard at the edge of the porch light, facing west, listening, the way livestock in a meadow lift their heads all together at a sound from beyond the fence that the farmer never hears at all. Stay below the rock, stay in the meadow, and pray that you are never one of the ones he considers, because the master of the game does not lose game, and the gathering is not undone. We always find the boat. That is the part one can never explain to the families. The boat comes back to us. We find it out in the open water of the basin, idling in a slow, lazy circle, the motor still running, the rod still in the holder, a thermos of coffee still warm in the cup holder, turning and turning on the black water like it is waiting for somebody to climb back aboard, except there is nowhere out there to climb down to. There is 40 feet of bayou under that boat, and 100 miles of cypress swamp around it, and no bank, no island, no log within reach. And there is no sign at all of the man who was driving it. I am a refuge ranger in the Atchafalaya Basin, the biggest river swamp in this country, down in the south of Louisiana. In 14 years I have pulled a lot of empty boats out of that water. I have never once pulled out the man who owned one. The swamp keeps those. And after the night I am about to tell you about, I finally understand what it is keeping them for. Let me get the small things out of the way fast, because I do not like to linger on the porch when there is weather coming, and there is weather coming in this one. If you would rather not miss the next account, then subscribe to the channel and turn that little notification bell on, so you are riding in the boat with me the next time I push off into something like this, and tap that like button while you are at it. It costs you nothing, and it does more than you would believe to carry a story like this one out to the people who need to hear it. Then, when you have a second, drop me a line down in the comments. Tell me where in this world you are sitting tonight, your town, your country, and what the hour is on your clock right now. I like to know how wide a story spreads in a single night, and how many of us are awake out here together while everybody else is sleeping easy. And I will be straight with you. I have done this a while, and I know good and well that your thumb has not touched that like button yet. So here is my deal. You press it now, before we leave the landing, and I will not say one more word about it once we are out on the water. Fair is fair. Go on and press it. There we go. Cast off. To understand any of this, you have to understand the basin, because the basin is not like any other wild place in this country, and the rules of the dry land do not hold out there. The Atchafalaya is a swamp the size of a small state, the largest river swamp in the United States, a vast flooded forest of bald cypress and tupelo gum draped in moss, laced through with bayous and canals and stretches of open water, all of it fed by the Mississippi when she runs high and drained by her when she runs low, so that the whole place breathes, rising and falling with the seasons. The water is black, stained dark as strong tea by the cypress, and you cannot see 1 inch below the surface of it. There are alligators in numbers a person from somewhere else would not believe. There are cottonmouths thick as your arm. There are stretches of that swamp where a man could disappear 10 feet off the main channel and never be found, not in 100 years, because the water keeps its own counsel and the swamp closes over a thing like a mouth. My name is Emile, my people are Thibodeau, and we have fished and trapped this basin for longer than anybody kept the records that would say how long. I grew up in a camp on stilts out on one of the bayous, with no power but a generator and no road but the water, and I knew how to run a pirogue before I knew how to ride a bicycle. I left for a while the way you do, tried the dry land and the cities, and the dry land did not want me and I did not want it. I came home. The wildlife refuge needed officers who could run the basin in any weather, day or night, who would not get lost out there and would not panic, and there are not many of those, because most people who can do it are out fishing it for money, not patrolling it for a salary. I could do it, and I loved it, and so I took the badge, and the basin took me back the way it always had. The job is its own thing. I patrol by boat, a flat aluminum hull with a mud motor for the shallows and an outboard for the runs. I check fishing and hunting licenses. I watch for poachers running gator lines out of season. I keep an eye on the oil and gas crews that have canals cut all through the basin, and when somebody does not come back from the water, I am the one they call. Search and rescue in the Atchafalaya is unlike search and rescue anywhere else, because the basin does not give a body back the way the land does. On land, the lost stay where they fell, and the dogs and the helicopters find them. In the basin, the water moves, the gators come, and a man who goes under is gone, most times for good. I have made my peace with that. It is the toll the swamp takes, and I have hauled out enough drowned fishermen and capsized hunters over the years to think I had seen the whole catalog of ways this place can kill a person. I had not. That is the thing I have had to learn. There was a whole chapter of it I had never read, and an old man and a young one taught it to me in the same terrible week. It started in the high heat of late summer, the kind of August in South Louisiana where the air sits on you like a wet wool blanket, and the swamp at noon goes still and heavy and silent under the sun. A young crawfisherman went missing out on the far side of the basin, in a maze of bayous where almost nobody runs except the men who have fished it their whole lives. His name was Lonnie Naquin. He was 24, and he came from one of the old basin families the same as me, and he had been running crawfish traps out of a small aluminum boat since he was a boy. He knew that water, that is the first thing every one of these stories has in common, and it is the thing that should have told me sooner what I was dealing with. The basin does not generally take the men who know it. It takes the tourists, the drunks, the careless. It does not take a Naquin who has run those same traps every dawn for 10 years. But Lonnie Naquin did not come back one morning, and by that afternoon they had found his boat. They found it exactly the way I told you at the start, out in a stretch of open water between 2 cypress breaks, idling in a slow circle, the little outboard still running on the last of its gas, his trap still stacked in the bow, his lunch still in the cooler, his cap floating in the bilge water in the bottom of the hull. No Lonnie, no blood. No sign of a struggle, no sign of a gator, no sign of anything but a man who had simply stopped existing between one trap and the next, on flat calm water, in the full light of an August morning, within sight of camps where other men were drinking their coffee. The call came to me because it was refuge water, and because I knew the family. Lonnie Naquin was the nephew of a man named Roy Naquin, and Roy was about the best swamper left alive in that part of the basin. A lean, leathery old Cajun past 70 who had forgotten more about that water than the rest of us would ever learn. Roy rolled his own cigarettes and smoked them down to nothing, and he was missing most of his back teeth, and he talked to the swamp under his breath the way some men talk to a dog, low and constant, a running murmur in French and English both. Roy had half-raised Lonnie after the boy's father passed, and when I came to the landing that first evening, Roy was already there, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, not crying, just staring out at the water with a stillness that was worse than crying. And he looked at me when I walked up and he said, "Before I could say one word of the things you say," he said, "you are going to want to call it a drowning, Emil. Do not call it a drowning, not yet. You come out with me in the morning, and you keep your mouth shut, and you look at what I show you, and then you call it whatever you got the stomach to call it." I did not know what to say to that, so I said I would come. That night, before I went home to sleep what little I could, I did a thing I had not done in years. I drove out the long way, past the edge of the basin, to a little house at the end of a shell road where an old woman lived, a woman my grandmother had known. Her name was Odile, and she was a traiteur, which is our word for a kind of folk healer, the old French Catholic kind we still have down here, who treats burns and warts and the troubles you do not take to a hospital, with prayers and laying on of hands. I do not know fully why I went to her. I think Roy's stillness had put a fear in me that did not have a name yet, and I wanted somebody older and closer to the old ways to tell me I was being a fool. Tante Odile was on her porch in the heavy night air, and she let me sit, and I told her a Naquin boy had gone off his boat out in the deep basin and left no trace. She was quiet a long time, rocking. Then she asked me one question. She asked me, had the boy been good to the water? Had he taken more than he needed, fouled it, run it hard, disrespected it? I told her no, that Lonnie was a good boy, a careful fisherman, an old family. And Odile nodded slowly, and she said a thing that did not comfort me at all. She said, "Then it did not take him for spite. It took him because it wanted him. That is worse, Chair. The first kind you can make right. The second kind," and she did not finish it. She crossed herself, and she would say no more about it that night except one last thing, as I was leaving, that I did not understand until much later. She said, "When you go out there, you mind the sounds. The swamp, she has her own voice, day and night. You know it like your own breathing. When her voice goes wrong, when the night birds and the frogs all hush at once and something starts up that you do not know, that is it putting on a new skin to come close. You do not answer, you do not go to it, you come on home." And then she went inside and left me standing in the heavy black night with the frogs roaring all around, listening to the swamp's voice and praying it would not go wrong. I want to stop us right here, on the landing, in the last calm before I push the boat off into the rest of this. Because once Roy and I get out on that water in the morning, it does not let up. So if this story has its hooks in you, take the 1 second it costs to like this video and to subscribe to the channel, so the next person can find their way out here the same as you did. It is the small, dry, easy thing, done while you are still safe on the bank. Almost nobody in this story got to do the small, easy thing in time. You can do it now. I did not sleep much. Before first light I met Roy Naquin at the landing, and we loaded into my boat, and we pushed off into the gray, into the mist that lay on the black water like smoke, and Roy guided me with a low murmur and a pointed finger, deeper and deeper into the part of the basin where his nephew had run his traps, where the cypress grew so thick and old that the canopy closed overhead, and the morning stayed a green twilight down on the water, and the camps fell away behind us, and the cell signal died, and it was just the two of us, and the swamp, and the slow black water, going to look at the thing Roy could not bring himself to name on dry land. Roy took me first to the place where they had found Lonnie's boat. It was a wide stretch of open water, a flooded clearing in the cypress, maybe 200 yards across, ringed by the gray trunks and their knees rising up out of the water like teeth. It was a pretty place in the early light, mist still curling off the surface, a heron standing in the shallows on the far side, an ordinary beautiful piece of basin, and Roy cut my motor a good way out from it and let us drift. And he sat there in the bow looking at that clearing, with his jaw working, and he would not go into it. I asked him what we were looking for. He did not answer right away. He pointed, instead, to the cypress at the near edge of the clearing, and he told me to take us slow along the tree line, the trolling motor only, no gas. So I did. And as we eased along the edge of that clearing, in under the moss, Roy began to show me the things he had come to show me, and one by one they took the bottom out of everything I thought I knew about my own swamp. The first thing was the claw marks. High up on the cypress trunks, at the waterline edge of the clearing, there were gouges in the bark. Deep ones, 4 parallel lines, the way a gator will mark a tree, except a gator does not climb, and these were 6 feet up the trunk and 8, and on one tree they ran up past 10 feet, far above where any gator in that swamp could reach from the water. Roy put his hand flat against one set, and his hand, a big swamper's hand, did not span the width between the outer two grooves. Whatever had cut them had a paw, or a hand, half again the width of his. The second thing was the nutria. Nutria are the big swamp rats, everywhere in the basin, the main food of the gators. Roy took us into a little side slough off the clearing, and there, on a half-sunk log, were nutria, 4 of them dead, and they had not been eaten. They had been laid out, in a row, on the log, side by side, evenly spaced, their bodies arranged with a care that no predator has, because a predator eats its kill or caches it sloppy, and these were placed, displayed, the way you would line up tools on a bench, and they had been opened up in a way I am not going to describe in full, except to say that it was done with a precision that turned my stomach, and that it was not the work of any animal that lives in that swamp, or any I have heard of. The third thing was the smell. We came around a screen of cypress into a narrow dead-end bayou, and the smell hit us both at once, rolling out over the water, and it stopped Roy's low murmur cold for the first time all morning. It was a heavy, rank, musky stench, like a wet dog and a dead thing and something under both of them that I have no word for, and it sat in that dead-end bayou with no breeze to move it, thick enough to taste. And Roy reached back without looking and gripped my arm and turned us around right there. And we got out of that bayou fast, and once we were back in moving air he let out a breath and said, "Lo, that is its bed, one of them. It lays up in the heat of the day in a place like that, in the deep shade, in the still air, where the smell cannot carry to give it away. We do not go in there, not in the day, not ever." I asked him finally the question I had been holding all morning. I asked him what it was. Roy Naquin was quiet a long while, easing us along the black water. Then he said the only real piece of explaining anyone ever gave me, and it was not much, and he did not pretend it was. He said his grandfather had called it by an old name, a swamp name, that he was not going to say out loud out here on its water. He said it was not a gator, and not a bear, and not a man, though it could move in the water like the first, and stand up tall as the second, and was cunning as the third, and worse. He said it did not live in the basin so much as the basin was the thing it lived inside of, the way a spider lives inside its web, and that it had been here before the Naquins and the Thibodeau and the rest of us, and would be here after. He said it did not take many, 1 a year, maybe less, sometimes none for a long stretch, so that men forgot, so that it became a story old swampers told and young ones laughed at. And he said it almost never took a swamper, one of the old families, one who knew and respected the water, and that this was the thing that had him so afraid, because it had taken Lonnie, who knew that water as well as any man alive, and that meant the rules had changed, or that it had wanted Lonnie in particular, the way Odile had said, and Roy did not know which was worse. I asked him how he knew so much about a thing he would not name, and Roy Naquin looked at me with his old creek-colored eyes, and he said, "Because I saw it take my brother Emile, Lonnie's daddy, 40 years ago, off the back of a boat I was sitting in on water as calm as glass. I have been waiting 40 years for it to come back around the family, and now it has." And that was all he would say, and the morning had gone hot and bright and ordinary around us, the swamp's voice loud with insects and birds, and I would have given anything to believe that Roy Naquin was a grieving old man telling himself a story, except that I had put my own hand in those claw marks, and I had smelled that bed, and I had seen those nutria laid out in their row, and no story I knew could account for any of it. We worked the basin the rest of that day, looking for any sign of Lonnie himself, finding none. And as the afternoon wore on toward evening, I made the decision that I have gone over 1,000 times since. The right call, the procedure call, would have been to take Roy back to the landing at dusk and bring a full team out the next day, in numbers, in daylight, and to keep every boat off that water at night. But Roy would not hear of leaving. He believed, he told me, that the thing kept what it took, for a while, alive, in a place, before whatever it did at the end, and that there was a chance, a small one, that Lonnie was still somewhere out in that maze, and that one more night might be the difference. I did not fully believe it, but I could not put my hand on the throttle and run for the landing and leave a Naquin out there on the strength of my own doubt, with the boy's uncle begging me to look. So I made the wrong call, the human one. We stayed out. We would run the deep bayous in the last of the light, calling for Lonnie, and be off the water by full night. We did not make it off the water by full night. The basin is a maze, and the evening comes fast under that canopy. And we were deep in it when the light began to fail, miles from the landing through 100 wrong turns, and I made the second hard call, which was that running those bayous at speed in the night was more likely to kill us on a stump or a log than anything else was, and that we would tie off to a cypress in a sheltered spot, wait out the night, and run for home at first light. Roy agreed. We found a good spot, a small clearing with deep water and a big old cypress to tie to, and we settled in, and I let the boat swing on its line, and the night came down over the basin, and for a few hours it was only the basin. The ordinary swamp at night, which is one of the loudest places on this earth, a wall of sound, frogs by the million, insects, the grunt and bellow of gators off in the breaks, the cry of a night heron, the whole black flooded forest singing its song that I have known since before I could walk. I lay back against my pack with my hand on the spotlight, and I listened to it, and it was almost a comfort, that loud familiar voice. And I let myself believe we would be all right until morning. It was somewhere in the deep middle of the night that Tante Odil's warning came true, and the swamp's voice went wrong. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a room goes quiet when one person after another stops talking. First the frogs near us hushed, then the insects, then the further frogs, and the gators, and the night birds, in a spreading ring of silence that moved out from somewhere across the water and swallowed the whole roaring voice of the swamp, until there was nothing left but the drip of water off the moss and the small slap of the hull and Roy Naquin's breathing in the bow, which had gone fast and shallow. I have spent my life in that swamp, and I had never once heard it go fully silent. It is not a thing that happens. The basin does not hold its breath. It was holding its breath now. And then, out across the black still water, something began to call, and it was not a sound I knew. It was low and wet, and it rose and fell in a way that almost had a shape to it, almost like words, almost like a voice trying to remember how a voice goes. And it came from out in the cypress, and it was answered, a moment later, from a different direction, by the same wrong call, so that for one cold moment I could not tell if there was one of them or two, or if the swamp itself was throwing the sound back. Roy had gone rigid in the bow. He reached back and gripped my wrist hard, the same as he had at the bed that morning, and he put his mouth close to my ear and breathed, so low I felt it more than heard it. Do not answer it. Do not shine that light. Whatever it sounds like next, you hold still, and you keep quiet, and you do not look for it. And I did not understand the whatever it sounds like next, not yet. I understood it a few minutes later, and I have never stopped understanding it since, because the wrong calling stopped, and the silence stretched out, heavy as the water. And then, out of the night, from the cypress maybe 40 yards off our bow, a young man's voice came across the water, clear and frightened and exhausted, and it called out, "Uncle Roy? Uncle Roy, is that you? Help me, I am over here. I am hurt, please." And it was Lonnie Naquin's voice. I had never heard the boy speak in life, but I felt Roy Naquin's whole body seize when it came across that water, and I knew, the way you know a thing in your spine before your mind agrees to it, that the swamp had put on a new skin, exactly as the old woman said it would, and that the thing out there in the night was wearing the voice of the boy it had taken, and using it to call his grieving uncle off the boat and into the black water. I have to tell you what it cost Roy Naquin not to answer that voice, because it is the bravest and most terrible thing I have ever watched a man do, and I watched it from 2 feet away in the lightless middle of that swamp. The voice called again, "Uncle Roy, I can see your boat. Why are you not coming? Please, it hurts. Come get me." And it was perfect. It was the boy, exactly. The catch of fear in it, the particular way he must have said Uncle Roy 10,000 times since he was small. And Roy Naquin, who had half raised that boy, who had been waiting 40 years for this thing to come back around his family, who wanted nothing in this world but to find Lonnie alive, sat in the bow of my boat in the night, with his hands locked white around the gunwale and tears running down into his white stubble and his jaw clamped shut. And he did not answer, and he did not move, and he made a low sound in his chest like a man holding back the worst grief of his life with his bare hands, because he knew better than anyone alive, that the boy was already gone, and that the voice was the bait, and that to answer it, to reach toward it, to give it one sound to home in on, was to die. I have never respected a human being more than I respected Roy Naquin in that hour. The thing tried for a long time. The voice came again and again, from one direction and then another, circling us slow through the cypress, the way the silence had circled us. And each time it was a little different, a little more pleading, and then a little less like Lonnie, and a little more like something working a tool it did not fully understand. The words slurring at the edges into that wet wrong call underneath. Once, near the end, it tried a different voice. It called Roy by a name I did not know, an old name, in a voice older than Lonnie's. And Roy made a sound like he had been struck, and I understood later that it had reached back 40 years and found the voice of his brother, Lonnie's father, the one it had taken off a calm boat all those years ago, and was using that too. It had kept that voice for 40 years. I think about that more than almost anything. It had kept his brother's voice for 40 years, waiting for a night like this one to use it. We held still. We held still and silent through all of it, through hours of it, and at some point the voices stopped, and the wrong calling stopped, and slowly, from the far edges inward, the ordinary voice of the swamp came back, a frog, then another, then the insects and the gators and the whole roaring chorus, and I have never been so glad to hear anything in my life, because it meant the thing had moved off, had given up on the two quiet fools in the boat for that night, and gone back to its bed before the light. We did not sleep. We sat in that boat with the spotlight ready and our backs to each other, watching the water in both directions until the gray came up in the east and gave us back the basin, and the moment there was light enough to run by, I started the motor and we ran for the landing, fast, too fast, banging off the chop, and neither of us looked back, and neither of us said one word the whole way in. We should have stayed off that water after that. I want that understood. By every measure of sense, the search for Lonnie Naquin should have become a recovery, run by a full team, in daylight, with the basin closed to everyone at night. And for 2 days, that is what it was. We ran the basin in numbers and in daylight, found nothing, no boy, no body, no further sign, and the official search wound down the way they do, and the talk turned to drowning, and currents, and the things the world can stand to believe. I let it. I did not tell the team about the claw marks 12 feet up the cypress, or the nutria laid out in their row, or the bed in the dead-end bayou, or the voice that had warned Lonnie Naquin across the black water in the night. I told them we had searched and found nothing, which was true, and was a fraction of the truth, and I have carried the rest of it alone, until now. But Roy Naquin would not let it go, and God help me, neither could I. On the third night, Roy came to my house after sundown. He had a plan, and it was a bad one, and I knew it was a bad one, and I went along with it anyway, because there was a piece of me that needed to know as badly as he did, and because I could not let an old man go back out onto that water alone. Roy believed, from the old stories, that the thing kept what it took in a place, for a while, before the end, and that the place would be near its bed, in the deep still heart of the basin where it laid up by day. He believed there was still a chance, a small and fading one, that some part of Lonnie was still out there in that place, and that we had one more night to find it before the thing finished whatever it did. And he believed, and this is the part that I let persuade me, that the thing hunted by night, away from its bed, and that the one time you might safely get close to where it kept its takings was in the gray hour before dawn, when it had come back in from its hunting and gone heavy and slow and sleeping in its bed. So a little after midnight, the two of us pushed off again into the basin, against every rule I had, with the plan to be deep in the heart of it, near that dead-end bayou where the bed was, in the gray hour before first light, and to look, fast and quiet, for the place where it kept what it took, and to be gone before the sun was full up. It was the worst decision of my life, and I made it with my eyes open. And the only thing I can say for myself is that I made it for an old man who had lost his whole family to that water and could not be talked out of going, and I would rather have died beside him than let him go alone. As it turned out, that very nearly was the choice. We ran without lights as much as we could, by the little moon and Roy's memory, deep into the basin, into the oldest part of it, where the cypress are giants and the water lies black and still as oil, and the canopy closes out the sky. We cut the motor a long way out from the dead-end bayou and went the last stretch on the trolling motor. In silence, the smell of the bed reaching us across the water, growing stronger, that rank wet musk, and Roy guided us not into the bed bayou, but into another one beside it, a narrow twisting slough that he believed led to the place we were looking for. And as the gray of first light began to seep down through the moss, we came around a last screen of cypress into a small hidden clearing in the deep heart of the swamp, and we found what it kept. I am going to tell you only the shape of it. Some of it belongs to the families, and some of it I cannot put into words that I could live with having said. There was a kind of platform or mound at the back of that clearing, built up out of the black water on a tangle of cypress knees and dragged deadfall and packed mud. A made thing, the work of years, and on it and around it the thing had kept its takings, the way Roy's old stories said, the way some part of me had refused to believe until I saw it. There were boats, old ones, swamped and rotted, and newer ones, and I saw, near the front, a small aluminum boat I recognized, because I had seen its twin idling empty in a clearing 4 days before. And there were the takings themselves, what the swamp and the years and the thing had left of them, going back further than I let my eyes follow, and near the newest of them, I will tell you, because Roy made a sound when he saw it, that I will hear until I die, was a young man, and there was enough left to know him, and it was Lonnie Nocquin. And he had not been alive for some days, and he had been kept and arranged, made part of that terrible made place, the same as all the rest. Roy Nacin went toward him. Of course he did. I should have stopped him, the way I have replayed stopping him 10,000 times since, but he came up out of the bow before I understood what he meant to do, up onto the edge of that mound in the gray half-light, reaching for the boy, making a low broken sound, his whole 40 years of waiting and grief pouring out of him at once. And the mound moved. What I had taken in the gray gloom for one more tangle of deadfall and mud and shadow at the back of that platform rose up and stood. And it was tall, far taller than a man, and broad and wrong, and the color of wet mud and gray hide. And it had been lying there in its bed the whole time, exactly where Roy's plan had counted on it being, sleeping heavy after its hunting, and Roy Nacin had walked right up onto its bed and into reach of it, and now it was awake, and it was rising, and the smell of it filled up the whole world. I did the only thing there was to do, and I did it without thinking, because there was no time to think. I had a flare gun in the boat, a signal gun, loaded, in the box by my seat, and my hand was on it before my mind had finished understanding what I was seeing. I fired it into the thing as it rose over Roy. The flare hit it square and burst, a roaring ball of red fire and smoke right against the bulk of it. And the thing came apart from its rising into a thrashing, scrambling recoil, a horrible fast fluid lunge backward off the mound and into the black water with a sound and a force that rocked my boat and threw a wave up over the gunwale. And in the red light of that burning flare, for 1 second, less than a second, I saw it whole. And I am not going to be able to give you that second, because my mind has it walled off behind a door that I do not open. And the not opening of that door is the only reason I am able to sit here and tell you the rest of this at all. I will tell you only that it was not a gator, and not a bear, and not a man, and that all three of those guesses are closer to the truth than the truth was. It went into the water. The flare died hissing on the surface, and Roy Nacin was down on the edge of the mound, where its rising had knocked him, and I drove my boat up against that terrible platform, and I grabbed him by the back of his shirt, and I hauled him, an old lean swamper, but dead weight now, over the gunwale and into the bottom of the boat. And I got the motor started, and I have never in my life been so grateful for an engine catching first pull. And I threw the throttle down and ran us out of that clearing, out of that slough, into the wider water, running blind through the gray cypress maze, with the wake throwing up behind us, and the thing came after us in the water. I could not see it. That was the worst part. I could only see its wake, a long, low surge in the black water off our flank, keeping pace, falling back, surging again, the way a thing pushes a wave ahead of itself when it swims just under the surface, fast, far faster than a gator, matching my boat, hurting us, and twice it came in close enough that the swell of it lifted our hull, and Roy, conscious now and gripping the seat, screamed at me to mind the stumps, to not pile us up, because to pile up in that water with that thing in it was to die. I ran that basin in the gray dawn, the way I have never run it before or since, by instinct and memory and terror, threading the cypress and the knees and the stumps at a speed that should have killed us a dozen times, and the wake stayed with us, off one flank and then the other, until we burst at last out of the deep heart of the swamp into a wider channel where the light was coming up full and clean, and somewhere in that channel, as the sun cleared the trees and laid down on the water, the wake fell away behind us and was gone and did not come back. I do not fully know why it broke off. I have thought about it for years. Maybe it would not follow into the full open light. Maybe the flare had hurt it or frightened it, a thing that has been the only fear in its swamp for 1,000 years, suddenly burned by a red fire out of a boat. Maybe it simply decided two of us, awake and running and armed with fire, were more than it cared to take that morning, when it had its takings already, and there would be other dawns and other careless men. I will never know. The not knowing is the thing I have learned to live alongside, like an old wound that aches before rain. We made the landing in full daylight, the two of us shaking and soaked and silent, and we tied up, and Roy Nakin sat down on the boards of that landing and put his face in his hands, and the sounds he made then were not for me to hear. So I walked a little way off and let the old man grieve his whole family at once on the planks of a boat landing in the morning sun. We did not tell anyone the truth. What truth was there to tell that any sane person would hear? We reported that we had found Lonnie Naquin deceased in a remote part of the basin, that the body was unrecoverable in the terrain and the water, which was true, because nothing on this earth was going to make me take a recovery team into that clearing. The record says Lonnie Naquin drowned crawfishing, body lost in the basin, the same as it says about his father 40 years before, the same as it says, I have since come to understand, about a long quiet line of basin men going back as far as the records go, every one of them a drowning, every one of them a boat found idling empty on calm water, every one of them a man who knew that swamp too well to drown in it. I have read back through the old reports since, on my own time, in the office at night, and once you know what you are looking at, the pattern is right there, hiding in plain sight, under 60 years of the word drowning, and I am the first one, maybe, to read them all together and see the shape of the thing in them, and I have told no one, because there is nothing to be done, and telling would only cost me my badge and my good name, and change nothing at all. The swamp keeps what it takes. The reports keep the rest. Roy Naquin passed away a little over a year later. Old age, his heart, the long grief. All of it. He went quiet, in his camp, on the water he had fished his whole life, and I was glad, in a way I cannot fully explain, that the swamp let him go on his own terms in the end, and did not take him the way it took the rest of his blood. I was with him near the end, and the last real thing he said to me, with that old clarity coming back into his eyes for a moment, was, "You keep off the heart of that basin at night, Emil. You hear me? It knows your boat now. It knows your boat." And then he was gone, and he took the last of the old knowing with him, and now there is only me, and now I suppose there is you. Here is the part one have never put in any report. The part that is the reason I am telling you all of this tonight. I still work the basin. I cannot leave it. It is the only thing I have ever been, or ever wanted to be, and most of it, the daylight miles of it, the open water, and the fish camps, and the herons, and the ordinary beautiful working swamp, is the great love of my life, and always will be. But I do not go into the deep heart of it anymore, into the old giant cypress where the water lies still as oil, and I do not, under any circumstance, for any reason, put my boat on that water after the sun goes down. I run the edges in the day, and I am off the water by dusk, every day, and the younger officers think the old swamper has gotten timid in his age, and I let them think it. Because twice now, on still evenings, running the edge of the basin a little later than I should have, with the gray coming down, I have heard, far off across the black water from the deep heart of the swamp, the night birds and the frogs all hush at once in a spreading ring of silence. And in that silence I have heard a voice come across the water, calling. Once it was Roy Naquin's voice, calling me by name, low and tired, telling me he was hurt, telling me to come on out and help him, from the deep heart of a swamp where Roy Naquin has been a year in his grave. I did not answer. I did not shine my light. I opened the throttle and I ran for the landing in the last of the light, and I did not look back. So if you take one thing from a tired old swamper tonight, take this. If you are ever out on still black water, deep in some great wild swamp, far from the camps, and you notice that the whole roaring voice of the place has gone silent all at once, that the frogs and the birds and the gators have all hushed together, then you are not alone, and the thing that hushed them is putting on a skin to come close. And if in that silence a voice you love calls to you across the water, hurt and pleading, and asking you to come, you remember the rule that an old man and an old woman both spent their last good breath teaching me. Do not answer it. Do not go to it. Do not give it one sound to find you by. Run for the light, and get yourself to dry land, and do not ever go back out onto the heart of that water in the night. Because the swamp keeps what it takes, and it is patient, and it has all the time in the world, and the only ones who ever come home are the ones who learn, while there is still light to learn it by, not to answer when the water calls them by name.